Over time, they grew close. What surprised Third Blake and the maids was that, subconsciously, they didn't see Ethan Blake as a mere child but rather as someone of their own age, earning their silent admiration. A few days later, Richard Blake sent word, summoning Ethan Blake to join the other young lords and princesses in studying literacy. This was precisely what Ethan had been hoping for. The Codex of Might contained not only illustrations but also text annotations, which he struggled to understand due to his limited literacy. This presented the perfect opportunity for him to learn. The Northern Duke's residence had its own private academy specifically for the education of the young lords. The tutors invited to teach were renowned scholars across the nation. Moreover, many influential officials, seeking to curry favor with the Northern Duke and strengthen ties with his family, sent their own children to study there, fostering a harmonious environment. Though Richard Blake was a hero on the battlefield, he was also adept at navigating social dynamics. He understood the intentions of these officials, but chose not to expose them, tacitly allowing the arrangement. While his military strength was formidable, building a vast network of power required more than brute force. It necessitated intricate relationships. Cultivating connections with their children was one such strategy. Ethan Blake carefully dressed, prepared his writing tools, and, accompanied by Third Blake, headed to the academy. The private academy, essentially a small refurbished estate, exuded tranquility. From a distance, the sounds of students reading aloud could already be heard. The atmosphere of scholarly pursuit was palpable even before they arrived. "Young master, just ahead is Bamboo Grove Academy. Servants like me are not allowed to enter, so I will wait for you here." Third Blake stopped walking and gestured for Ethan Blake to proceed on his own. Along the way, Third Blake had explained some of the academy's rules to Ethan Blake, giving him a basic understanding. Nodding in acknowledgement, Ethan adjusted his attire and confidently made his way toward Bamboo Grove Academy. At the arched entrance of Bamboo Grove Academy, 2 attendants stood guard. Observing them closely, Ethan noticed a noticeable bulge at their waists, clearly indicating concealed weapons. It made sense, considering the academy was filled with the offspring of nobles, high-ranking officials, and aristocrats, people of significant status and influence. Having guards for protection was only natural. The 2 attendants did not stop Ethan Blake. They simply nodded slightly, signaling that they had been informed of his arrival beforehand. Passing through the archway, Ethan found himself on a winding cobblestone path. Following the sound of recitations, he arrived at a building. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside to find the room brightly lit and warm, as if it were spring. Over 20 individuals turned their heads to look at him, their faces filled with curiosity. Chapter 25, Bullying. Ethan Blake pushed the door open and stepped inside. Over 20 young lords and princesses, engrossed in their books, simultaneously turned their heads to look at him, their faces filled with curiosity as they assessed him. The elderly teacher standing at the front frowned, his expression displeased but not angry. He simply asked coldly, "Are you Ethan Blake?" Ethan Blake felt a bit awkward, silently cursing himself for being careless. Third Blake had clearly reminded him to knock before entering, yet he had forgotten. Seeing Ethan Blake frozen in place, the elderly teacher furrowed his brows and said, "All right, find a seat and sit down. Don't disrupt everyone." Ethan exhaled in relief and looked around. Among the more than 20 people, he only recognized Owen Blake and his 3 brothers, as well as Princess Susan. Smiling at Owen Blake, he walked over and sat beside him. Owen Blake returned the smile with a nod but said nothing. The elderly teacher gave a light cough and resumed reading aloud from the book, shaking his head slightly as he did. Previously, Ethan Blake only knew how to write his own name and his mother's name. Now, Eager to delve into the content of the scriptures, he listened to the lecture with great focus. Sitting next to him, Owen Blake secretly nodded in approval. For someone of Owen Blake's age, attending school was no longer necessary. However, upon hearing that Ethan Blake would be coming today, he decided to attend. He was curious and held a favorable impression of the boy his father had taken under his wing. After all, this was the first time Owen had ever seen his father show such care for someone. The lesson lasted an entire hour. The elderly teacher seemed tired as he picked up the teacup on the small table in front of him, took a sip of the now-cold tea, and said, "All right, that's enough for today. If you have any questions, ask me tomorrow in class." With that, he left, leaving the students to socialize. As soon as the teacher departed, the classroom became lively. A few pampered young lords, laughing and joking, walked over to Ethan Blake and scrutinized him from head to toe. One of them, a chubby boy around 13 or 14 years old, said, "Hey, are you Ethan Blake?" Ethan, who was packing up his books, heard someone call his name. He looked up to see several unfamiliar faces and politely smiled. "Yes, that's me." "Good then." The fat man sneered, took a step forward, and suddenly grabbed Ethan Blake by the collar, lifting him off the ground. Taken by surprise, Ethan Blake couldn't react in time to use the martial arts he had learned. He let his opponent lift him and calmly asked, "What do you want?" "Humph. I heard the Northern Duke's residence has taken in a good-for-nothing. It annoys me." Though young, the fat man was tall and burly, his face full of flesh, making it obvious to everyone that he was deliberately picking a fight. "Fatty Paul, stop causing trouble." Owen Blake stood up and shouted, "Father treats Ethan Blake as his own son. Don't you dare bully him." Fatty Paul chuckled in response. "Brother Owen, it's just kids fighting. I'm sure Uncle Blake won't hold it against anyone." "You?" Owen Blake, being gentle and reserved by nature, wasn't skilled in arguments. Hearing this, he was at a loss for words, his face turning red with frustration. "Big brother, Jake is right. Humph. That Ethan Blake is so annoying just by looking at him. Perfect timing for Jake to help me vent my anger." At this moment, Susan Blake approached with her slender waist and graceful steps, truly a beauty to behold. The chubby boy, whose real name was Jake Paul, was a member of the royal family and accustomed to being unruly. At the age of 14 or 15, he had just begun to experience love and was infatuated with Princess Susan, obeying her every word. During their break today, Susan Blake had shared her grievances about Ethan Blake, and Jake immediately thumped his chest, promising to teach Ethan a lesson. Besides his prestigious background, Fatty Paul also had another advantage. Rumor had it that he had been trained in martial arts by a master since childhood. Though he appeared chubby, he was surprisingly agile. Hearing Susan speak up, Jake was eager to impress. He used his strength to lift Ethan Blake off the ground and shouted, "Kid, did you hear that? Princess Susan finds you unpleasant. Today, I'll make you taste some pain." With that, he flung Ethan Blake outward. Owen Blake cried out in alarm, but being a frail scholar, he was powerless to intervene. His younger brother, Connor Blake, however, had trained in martial arts and immediately leaped forward. Using the low tables arranged for ink and brushes as stepping stones, he dashed to try and catch Ethan Blake. However, what surprised everyone was that Ethan Blake's body twisted midair, flipping like a cat. His small frame arched gracefully before landing lightly on the ground. His eyes glinted with a cold, sharp light as he stared intently at Fatty Paul. Fatty Paul was momentarily stunned. Being trained in martial arts himself, he could tell that Ethan Blake had some skills. A sense of unease crept into his heart. If he failed to subdue Ethan and ended up displeasing Princess Susan, all his efforts would be in vain. Ethan Blake, simmering with anger, fixed his dagger-like gaze on Fatty Paul. After a long pause, he suppressed his fury, thinking to himself that fighting the chubby boy would completely offend Princess Susan. If he wanted to establish himself in the royal household in the future, this would only bring him more trouble. It was better to let it go for now. "Brother Jake, why are you just standing there? Are you scared of him?" Susan Blake did not hold back. Seeing Jake Paul staring blankly at Ethan Blake as if frightened, she raised her voice and spoke loudly. Jake Paul responded vaguely. Observing that Ethan Blake's imposing aura had diminished, he guessed that the other party must have some reservations. Feeling slightly reassured, he charged forward without saying a word. With a fist as large as a hammer, he swung directly at Ethan Blake's chest. Ethan Blake's lack of resistance did not mean he was willing to take the hit. He shifted his body to evade Fatty Paul's punch. However, Ethan had underestimated Fatty Paul's strength. This punch carried a hidden force, and its speed was astonishing. Ethan had only managed to dodge halfway when he heard a thud. The punch landed squarely on his shoulder. "Ah!" Ethan Blake cried out in pain, falling backward and crashing heavily into a small table in front of him. With a loud crash, the teacups on the table were sent flying and shattered into pieces. It turned out that this small table was the one used by the teacher. A searing pain radiated from Ethan's shoulder, tearing through his insides. His entire arm became immobile. His eyes flared with anger, an anger that had just been suppressed but now reignited uncontrollably. Slowly, he got up, his hand moving to his waist. He drew out a dagger, and a chilling murderous aura emanated from his entire being. At this moment, the room was filled with boys and girls aged 15 or 16, the youngest being 7 or 8 years old, the same age as Ethan Blake. Earlier, they had watched Fatty Paul's fight with a sense of amusement. After all, fights among noble children were a common occurrence. But no one had expected this newcomer, Ethan Blake, to lose his temper and draw a dagger. Fear gripped everyone. Their faces turned pale as they retreated. "Brother Ethan, don't act recklessly. If there's an issue, we can take it to Father," Owen Blake said anxiously. He was worried that if Ethan accidentally injured Fatty Paul, even with Richard Blake stepping in, it would be hard to explain the situation. Ethan Blake, however, ignored Owen's words. His innate stubbornness had flared up, and even 9 oxen couldn't pull him back. Fatty Paul stood still, his face dark and brooding. The punch he had just landed boosted his confidence. Now seeing Ethan draw a dagger, he thought to himself, "This kid, even with a knife, your father, won't fear you." Ha ha. The more he thought about it, the more certain he felt of his victory. A ferocious expression appeared on his plump face as he sneered. "You think holding a knife will scare me? Come on, take another punch from me." After speaking, he charged forward, courting death. Ethan Blake's pupils contracted as he raised the dagger in his hand and rushed ahead. This dagger had already claimed 2 lives, disciples from his sect no less. Thus, holding it gave him some sense of security. Even if he couldn't kill Fatty Paul, he intended to land a few strikes to vent his pent-up anger. Ethan Blake had calculated carefully, but the truth was, he had never truly practiced martial arts. He only relied on a superficial understanding gleaned from a manual, which was enough to intimidate Third Blake, a bully of children. However, when facing someone who genuinely knew martial arts, he was far outmatched. In less than one exchange, Fatty Paul landed a punch to his stomach. A loud thud echoed as Ethan's small frame was sent flying, crashing hard to the ground. The pain was so intense that tears and snot streamed uncontrollably. "Ha ha. So it was all an act." Fatty Paul laughed heartily. From just one clash, he had discerned Ethan Blake's true strength, or lack thereof, and was elated. Without waiting for Ethan to get up, he stepped forward and delivered a kick. Offending Princess Susan means offending me. Remember this. Next time you see Princess Susan, you better act like a little pup. He sneered, punctuating his words with a few more kicks. Ethan Blake lay on the ground, silent, his fierce gaze fixed on Fatty Paul. The intensity of his glare sent a chill down Fatty Paul's spine. Fatty Paul, that's enough. You'll kill him if you keep going? Owen Blake shouted, not daring to intervene, but raising his voice in protest. Fatty Paul ignored Owen entirely, turning instead to fawn over Susan Blake. Susan, if you say stop, I'll stop. Seeing Ethan Blake beaten to a pulp, Susan Blake's anger subsided. She frowned slightly and said, That's enough. All right. Ow! Damn it, that hurts. Fatty Paul responded gleefully, but his smile froze instantly. His face twisted in pain as his rotund body leapt into the air, clutching his leg and screaming miserably, resembling an oversized leather ball. It turned out that while he was basking in his triumph, Ethan Blake, still lying on the ground, had suddenly swung his dagger, stabbing it deep into Fatty Paul's calf. Blood quickly soaked through his cotton trousers. Beat him to death. Beat him to death for me. Fatty Paul shouted angrily, calling on his close group of spoiled young companions to help him vent his frustration. However, those companions were paralyzed with fear at the scene before them, especially when they saw Ethan Blake holding a knife and standing up again from the ground. Who would dare step forward? Don't bully me, or I'll kill you all, Ethan Blake said coldly, wiping the blood off his dagger with his sleeve. He approached Owen Blake, gathered the books scattered on the small table, and limped out of the room. The entire room fell silent. No one dared to speak a word. Only Fatty Paul's occasional groans of pain broke the stillness. It was only after a long while that Owen Blake snapped out of his daze. He quickly ordered Connor Blake to fetch a physician to treat Fatty Paul's injuries. Then, he turned to the crowd and said, What happened today? I hope no one mentions it. It's not only detrimental to the Blake family, but also to your parents as well. Everyone nodded in agreement. Although these spoiled young men were inexperienced, they had heard enough about the complexities of politics to understand the dangers involved. Owen Blake's words were a clear warning. Do not go home and spout nonsense, or you will be opposing the Blake family directly. Fatty Paul, knowing he was in the wrong, also understood that today's events were entirely his fault. His father was no fool, and knew exactly what kind of person his son was. Even if Fatty Paul went home to complain, his father wouldn't take his side, and might even punish him. Left with no other choice, he swallowed his anger. Feeling utterly humiliated, Fatty Paul glanced pitifully at Susan Blake, only to hear her scoff coldly and mutter, So useless. Fatty Paul's face turned red with embarrassment. Enduring the pain in his leg, he bowed his head, his eyes flashing with hatred as he thought bitterly. Ethan Blake, sooner or later, I'll make you pay for that stab. #### Chapter 26. Codex of Might. I must become stronger. I absolutely must become stronger. Ethan Blake felt the soreness all over his body as he stepped out of the bamboo library. The two guards stationed at the entrance, already accustomed to such scenes, merely nodded slightly in greeting. Ethan Blake lowered his head, repeatedly chanting in his mind, I must become stronger. The fight with Jake Paul, yes, the chubby Jake Paul, had just made him realize that what he had learned from the Codex of Might was merely scratching the surface. His victory over Third Blake a few days ago, which had scared the man out of his wits, was nothing more than a fluke, pure happenstance. Only by becoming stronger can I avoid being bullied by them. Only then can I hold my head high, Ethan thought, his desire for power growing ever more intense. Oh heavens, my young master! Why are you covered in blood? Third Blake, who had been waiting idly, was startled when he saw Ethan Blake stumbling out of the library, bloodied and unsteady on his feet. Rushing over in concern, he asked anxiously, though inwardly he wondered, "Isn't he supposed to be a skilled fighter? How could those spoiled brats beat him up like this?" Hearing Third Blake's concerned tone, Ethan Blake felt a warmth in his heart. Waving a hand dismissively, he replied, "It's nothing. This blood isn't mine. Heh heh." Third Blake froze for a moment, then silently berated himself for his foolishness. Although Ethan's face bore a few bruises, there were no visible wounds, so of course, the blood must belong to someone else. At the same time, he couldn't help but marvel. His young master was truly fierce. It was rare for someone to shed blood on their very first day at the academy. The master and servant made their way back to Huyu courtyard, drawing curious stares from onlookers. Ethan Blake, however, paid no attention, keeping his head down as he calculated how quickly he could learn more characters to fully grasp the Codex of Might and begin proper training. The next day, Ethan Blake returned to the academy, but the chubby Jake Paul was nowhere to be seen. The gazes of others toward him now carried a hint of fear, and even Susan Blake didn't dare meet his eyes. Only the four brothers of the Blake family remained as warm and friendly as ever. Ethan had initially worried that Richard Blake might bring up the incident, but in the end, everything remained peaceful and uneventful. It was just that the old scholar, after arriving at the private school, flew into a rage. The reason was none other than his beloved teacup being shattered into pieces. Time passed swiftly, and in the blink of an eye, 3 months had gone by. Over the past 6 months, Ethan Blake's life had undergone earth-shattering changes, unimaginable to the average person. Today, after returning to Huyu courtyard from the private school, Ethan Blake dismissed Third Blake and the 4 maids, closed the door to his room, and sat cross-legged on a mat. He took the Codex of Might out from his chest, gazing intently at the thin book, his eyes glowing with excitement. Codex of Might. Ethan Blake gently caressed the bold characters on the book's cover, feeling deeply stirred. By now, he could read the book fluently, and for the parts he didn't understand, he had repeatedly consulted the old scholar to grasp their meaning. The old scholar, being a Confucian, was curious about the peculiar questions Ethan Blake often posed, but highly praised his eagerness to learn, answering every query with great detail. In this book, just as Sister Selena said, it indeed records the foundational techniques of cultivation. The methods of cultivation here far surpass the martial arts of the mortal world. Ethan Blake slowly flipped through the pages, engraving the key points into his mind. At this moment, he realized that cultivation was divided into multiple levels. The discussions about the realms of sect cultivators he had heard before now made sense to him. It turned out that the path of cultivation was divided into 4 stages and 20 realms, with each realm further subdivided into 3 levels: upper, middle, and lower. The 4 stages are body refinement, core formation, undying, and cycle of souls. Among these, body refinement is further broken down into marrow cleansing, bone tempering, tiger subjugation, divine transformation, and mind purification. Daniel Carter, in the past, was a master at the divine transformation stage. The next stage is core formation, which is subdivided into energy guidance, form shaping, spirit completion, foundation stabilization, and golden core. Only upon reaching this stage can one truly be called a cultivator, and qualified to become an inner disciple of a sect. Miss Emma Watson and the senior brother of the Cycle of Souls order are both cultivators at this stage. Once the golden core is condensed, one can advance to the next stage, the undying stage. This stage is further divided into tribulation crossing, true deity, divine communication, heavenly cave, and star rotation. For instance, the master from Virtue Keep, who leveled a mountain with a single sword strike, belongs to this stage, though Ethan Blake does not know their exact realm. As for the Cycle of Souls stage, it includes annihilation, illusory realm, mirror of clarity, summit gathering, and ascension. Regarding the three stages of core formation, undying, and Cycle of Souls, the manual only briefly mentions them without detailed descriptions. Ethan Blake was fortunate enough to have direct or indirect contact with masters at these levels, enabling him to estimate their strength and abilities. The Codex of Might served as an introductory manual, containing extremely detailed records of the initial stages. To learn about the subsequent stages, one would likely need to join a sect. Marrow cleansing involves physical training that maximizes the human body's functions. This includes exercises such as horse stance, jump rope, running, punching sandbags, and lifting stones to thoroughly train muscles and ligaments, resulting in physical strength far beyond the average person. Bone refining focuses on practicing various fist and kick techniques to comprehensively strengthen the tendons, bones, and skin. Reaching this level marks the beginning of becoming a martial artist, with some foundation for combat. The tiger subduing stage, simply put, is the pinnacle of training the tendons, bones, and skin, granting the ability to subdue tigers and leopards. Achieving this stage signifies mastery. As for divine transformation and clear mind, these involve cultivating from the external to the internal, laying the groundwork and preparing for the second phase. How many years would it take to master all these stages? Over the past 3 months, Ethan Blake had practically memorized the Codex of Might, every word etched into his mind. Yet, thinking about the hardships ahead made him slightly anxious. Damn it! Stop overthinking! Without enduring hardship, how could I ever hold my head high and become a cultivator worthy of respect? Ethan Blake shook his head, brushing away his hesitation, and began planning what he needed to start the first step of his cultivation journey. Although Charles Green had given him the incredibly precious Genesis elixir, the pill's medicinal power was so potent that Ethan Blake had only absorbed a small portion, while the rest remained hidden somewhere in his body, its location unknown even to him. Nevertheless, his physique had already transformed, laying a solid foundation for his future cultivation. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Spreading out paper, ink, and brush, Ethan Blake quickly jotted down his thoughts, then pushed open the door and called for Third Blake. Third Blake did not go far and remained waiting dutifully outside the room, truly a dedicated servant. Upon hearing Ethan Blake call for him, he immediately rushed over. Third Blake, buy everything listed here and deliver it to the back of the small pavilion. I need them, Ethan Blake said, handing him a piece of paper with a list. Third Blake glanced at it and couldn't help but ask, Young master, why are there items like stone locks and sandbags on this list? That's none of your concern. Just buy them. Take this, Ethan Blake replied, tossing a gold leaf from his chest to Third Blake. His eyes immediately lit up with excitement, and he cheerfully said, Rest assured, young master, I will handle everything perfectly. With that, he happily departed. Buying those items wouldn't even cost a gold leaf. Just 1 or 2 taels of silver would suffice. Clearly, Ethan Blake was rewarding him, so how could he not feel joyful and dedicate himself wholeheartedly to the task? It wasn't until late afternoon that Third Blake hired someone to deliver the items Ethan Blake requested. With everything prepared, Ethan Blake was in no rush. He secluded himself in his room to carefully plan his training routine before eventually drifting off into a light sleep. The next morning, just as the sun began to rise, Ethan Blake woke up and quietly sneaked to the back of the small pavilion to begin training his body. Time flew by, and soon it was close to the new year. The entire royal residence became bustling with activity, as servants and maids busied themselves decorating with lanterns, shopping for the festivities, and preparing for the celebration. Huyu courtyard, too, was filled with a joyous atmosphere. After several months of training, Ethan Blake had not only grown taller, but also transformed his once frail physique into a strong and robust one. At this moment, he was chatting with Third Blake and a few others, sharing the latest gossip he'd overheard from the wealthy young masters at the private academy. Suddenly, Trucy rushed in from outside, panting heavily. "Young Master Ethan Blake, the Duke has summoned you," she announced. Ethan Blake was the term used by the 4 maidservants to address him, a gesture that neither crossed boundaries nor lacked warmth, making it perhaps the only exception within the royal residence. "I wonder what His Grace has summoned me for." Ethan Blake frowned. He had been in the royal estate for 4 months now, and Richard Blake had shown him considerable care, even more so than toward his own children. Yet, their encounters had been rare. Moreover, Ethan Blake couldn't shake the sharp glint he had once seen in Richard Blake's eyes, which left him guarded and reserved during their meetings. Now, with the new year approaching, he was being called upon again. What could it be about? "I heard that Princess Sophia has returned. Perhaps His Grace wishes for the 2 of you to meet," Trucy remarked. "Princess Sophia?" Ethan Blake suddenly recalled Sophia Blake, whom he had encountered in Moonlight Hollow. Could it be that Sophia Blake is Richard Blake's daughter? As Ethan Blake fell silent in thought, the room grew quiet, with no one daring to speak. The stillness weighed heavily in the air. "If Sophia Blake is the princess here, this could be trouble. And if Lady Emma Watson from that day isn't dead, she might return as well. What would she do if she saw me?" The memory of Lady Emma Watson tightened Ethan Blake's chest. If she hadn't been poisoned that day, he might not have survived. "What should I do now?" Ethan Blake furrowed his brows deeper before finally asking. "Sister Trucy, did Princess Sophia return alone, or was someone with her?" Trucy hesitated for a moment before replying. "I'm not entirely sure, but when the princess left, Lady Emma Watson from Virtue Keep was with her. It's likely they've returned together." Her voice carried a note of curiosity, but as a servant, she dared not pry further into her master's affairs. "Humph. Even if Lady Emma Watson is returned, so what? Richard Blake wouldn't let her harm me," Ethan Blake muttered, drawing a deep breath to suppress the fear stirring within him. He then summoned Third Blake to accompany him to meet the Northern Duke, Richard Blake. Whether it was a blessing or a curse, only meeting Princess Sophia would reveal the truth. Hashtag chapter 27. 7 years. Boom! A loud explosion echoed through the courtyard. At this moment, the warm spring weather filled the air, nature was reviving, ice was melting, and the small pond in the courtyard had already thawed. A gentle breeze swept across, causing faint ripples on the water's surface. By the pond's edge, trees were budding and sprouting leaves, showcasing a vibrant green hue of spring. The loud explosion originated from an open area near the small pond, where a massive boulder weighing hundreds of pounds crashed to the ground, shattering into dozens of fragments. A robust young man, with a handsome appearance, stood nearby, observing the shattered pieces of rock on the ground. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself, "Looks like I'll need a bigger rock next time." This young man was none other than Ethan Blake, who had once sought refuge in the Northern Duke's residence. Time had flown by, and the frail boy of the past had grown into a strong and striking young man. 7 years had passed since he first arrived at the Northern Duke's residence. During these long years, Ethan Blake had dedicated himself to rigorous study and relentless training, mastering every move in the Codex of Might to perfection. His body had become exceptionally sturdy, and his every gesture now exuded the aura of a true expert. The Codex of Might was an introductory manual for spiritual cultivators, far surpassing any martial arts techniques of the mortal realm. Combined with Ethan Blake's tireless efforts, it was no surprise that he had achieved such remarkable progress. I wonder what stage of the body refinement realm I'm in now. Surely, I must have reached the bone refinement stage by this point. Ethan Blake furrowed his brows, pondering his own strength. Ever since he injured Jake Paul, a chubby figure, 7 years ago, using a knife, not only did the descendants of the Northern Duke's household avoid provoking him, but even the offspring of other noble families steered clear of him. As a result, he hadn't had any opportunities to fight and test his abilities, leaving him unsure of the extent of his own power. Thinking about this, a smile appeared on Ethan Blake's handsome face as he muttered to himself, "Why doesn't that chubby Jake Paul come to bother me? At least then I'd have someone to practice with. Ethan Blake, Ethan Blake." While he was lost in thought, a clear, bell-like voice rang out from afar. Shortly after, a graceful figure clad in purple appeared within Ethan Blake's line of sight. "It's Princess Sophia." Upon hearing the voice, Ethan immediately recognized who it was, instantly guessing the identity of the approaching figure. A memory began to surface in his mind. That day, as the Lunar New Year approached, the entire Northern Duke's household was immersed in a festive atmosphere. However, Ethan Blake received a summons from Richard Blake, the Northern Duke himself. He was informed that a princess of the household had returned from a long journey, and that all the descendants were required to pay their respects. Hearing the mention of a princess, Ethan couldn't help but think of Sophia Blake, whom he had once met at Moonlight Hollow, and he wondered if it might be the same person. What worried him more, however, was the possibility that Princess Sophia might be accompanied by a disciple of Virtue Keep, a woman they all referred to as Lady Emma Watson. Lady Emma Watson held no goodwill toward Ethan Blake. On that fateful day, she had nearly drained him of his blood. Yet, living within the household, he couldn't avoid attending the formal greeting for the newly returned princess. With a heavy heart and mounting anxiety, Ethan made his way to Richard Blake's reception hall. As he had suspected, Princess Sophia was indeed Sophia Blake. When the two met again, their joy was palpable and needed no words. To Ethan's relief, Lady Emma Watson wasn't present. Her absence reassured him, as he knew he would be safe as long as she wasn't around. Princess Sophia had already harbored a favorable impression of Ethan Blake and had often wondered if they would meet again. She hadn't expected that Ethan Blake would now reside in her household, living under the same roof. Naturally, this filled her heart with delight. Moreover, Ethan Blake and Princess Sophia were of similar age. The two children, spending time together, always had countless topics to discuss, earning admiration from the adults around them. From that point on, they often played and studied together, allowing Ethan Blake to finally experience the joys of childhood. Compared to the dangers he had endured, such a peaceful life was something many could only dream of. However, Ethan Blake had great ambitions. He woke up early every day to train, and in the blink of an eye, 7 years had passed. Princess Sophia had grown into a stunning beauty, exuding the grace of a peerless maiden. As the daughter of the Duke of Northern Command, whose concubines were all renowned beauties, it was natural that his offspring would inherit such exceptional qualities. "Sigh, the princess is up early today," Ethan Blake remarked with a wry smile. At this moment, dawn had barely broken, and the other members of the household were still deep in slumber. Only the servants and maids were awake, busy preparing breakfast, washing up, and attending to their masters. For Ethan Blake, waking up early to train had become a habit, but he hadn't expected Princess Sophia to be awake as well today. "Ethan Blake, I knew you'd be here." A delicate fragrance wafted through the air as Princess Sophia's graceful figure approached, her youthful scent lingering. "Princess, why are you up so early?" Ethan Blake, being her childhood companion, spoke casually without much formality. He picked up a handkerchief from the bench by the lake, wiped the sweat from his face, and asked, "Who says I can't wake up early? I've made up my mind. From now on, I'll wake up early every day to train with you," Sophia declared. Her exquisite beauty and radiant smile revealed her captivating charm. She wrinkled her nose playfully, looking adorably mischievous. "Ha ha. Princess, you've said that 100 times already, and each time you never last more than 3 days. Ethan Blake teased with a laugh. "Humph. What's so funny about that? This time it's different. I'm determined," Sophia retorted, slightly annoyed at Ethan Blake's laughter. She raised her small fist as if threatening to strike him. Ethan Blake quickly pretended to dodge, grinning as he said, "Princess, please spare me. I believe you, I really do. Big mouth." Sophia shot him a glance before her eyes fell on the shattered stones scattered on the ground. Curious, she asked, "Ethan Blake, why is this rock broken?" Ethan shrugged helplessly and replied, "I got carried away while training earlier and punched it. I didn't expect it to be so fragile and break apart." "Fragile?" Sophia looked unconvinced. "This rock must weigh over 100 pounds and is incredibly sturdy. Are you really saying it couldn't withstand your punch?" Ethan Blake gave a wry smile. "I'm telling the truth, aren't I?" Sophia Blake pursed her lips, tilted her head in thought for a moment, and then said, "Ethan Blake, I really intend to train with you from now on. This time I'm serious." Ethan Blake was taken aback. Over the past 7 years, Princess Sophia had always said she wanted to train with him, but she never lasted more than 3 days before giving up due to exhaustion. Why was she so serious this time? "Are you sure this isn't just another whim? Haven't you had enough of the hardships yet?" Ethan Blake teased her. At the mention of the hardships involved in training, Sophia Blake's expression shifted slightly. After a moment, she bit her lip and said, "This time I'm serious." Her tone implied that no matter how tough it got, she would endure it. Normally, the two of them joked and laughed together, and Ethan Blake had never seen her this earnest before. He couldn't help but ask, "There must be a reason for this, right?" Sophia Blake suddenly seemed tense. She glanced around nervously, ensuring the surroundings were quiet, before leaning close to Ethan Blake and whispering, "Ethan Blake, I know a secret." Though the two had grown up together and were very close, as they grew older, they had come to understand the differences between men and women and the boundaries that should be respected. Thus, while they often joked and played together, they rarely engaged in overly intimate contact. Yet at this moment, Princess Sophia suddenly leaned in so close that they were mere inches apart. Their breaths mingled, and the faint, pure fragrance of the young girl wafted into Ethan Blake's nose. Her gentle breathing was like a soft breeze, and her entire being radiated warmth. Her exquisite face was nearly touching his cheek, and with each breath, her chest rose and fell, a sight that was dizzying. For a 14 or 15-year-old boy just beginning to understand love, this was an overwhelming temptation. Staring at Sophia's flawless face, Ethan Blake's breathing quickened, and his face flushed red. "Hey, Ethan Blake, why aren't you asking me what the secret is?" Princess Sophia pouted, curiously questioning him. But seeing Ethan Blake staring at her intently, she suddenly felt flustered. Her face turned crimson, and she instinctively pulled back. "Ah!" Snapped out of his daze by Sophia's question, Ethan Blake silently scolded himself for losing composure. Feeling a bit awkward, he stammered, "What secret? I thought you were just going to sit there staring blankly." Sophia Blake teased, though she wasn't angry. On the contrary, she seemed a little pleased. The heart of a young maiden is always more sensitive than that of a young man. From Ethan Blake's gaze, she could sense his infatuation with her. "Hee, are you mad at me?" Ethan Blake foolishly asked. "Silly like a little pig," Sophia Blake replied, falling silent for a moment before hurriedly changing the subject. afraid the awkwardness between them might continue. I heard from Mother that in half a year, Virtue Keep will select a few talented disciples from among the princes of the royal family to take under their wing. This is a great opportunity. Pausing briefly, she added, Do you still remember Sister Watson? Since I was little, I've always wanted to become a powerful cultivator like her, soaring through the skies and commanding the winds and rain. As Sophia Blake spoke, her eyes sparkled with hope, as if she truly believed she could achieve such feats in the near future. Hearing this news, Ethan Blake felt a surge of joy in his heart, thinking to himself, This is my chance. If I can join Virtue Keep, I'll have the opportunity to become a true master cultivator. More than 7 years ago, the cultivators he had encountered were all extraordinary figures of immense power, a common trait among them. Over the years, his relentless training was meant to lay the foundation for his future as a cultivator, and now it seemed that heaven had not turned a deaf ear to his efforts. The opportunity had finally arrived. Mother, I will do my best to join Virtue Keep. From now on, I'll achieve greatness and hold my head high, Ethan resolved silently. As Sophia Blake continued to share her dreams, she noticed Ethan's dreamy gaze, and couldn't help but feel a flutter in her heart. Could Ethan Blake be thinking about me? She wondered. This thought made her cheeks flush even more, and she felt like an unrestrained young woman, secretly hoping Ethan Blake was thinking of her, remembering her. Sophia! Ethan Blake suddenly called out. Sophia's entire body tensed. He called me Sophia, not Princess. What is he trying to do? Sophia, you're right. This is a big opportunity, a huge one. I also want to become a cultivator, to roam the world and stand above all others. All right, from today onward, let's train together. Ethan Blake's eyes suddenly became extraordinarily clear, his unwavering determination shining through. What am I even thinking? Sophia Blake thought, her face burning with embarrassment. She turned her head away, not wanting Ethan Blake to see her flustered expression, and softly said, All right. Then let's become cultivators together. Her voice was so faint, it was almost inaudible, but it unmistakably conveyed her feelings. As for Ethan Blake, he lifted his head to gaze at the morning sky, his mind filled with images of the monks, paying no attention to the thoughts of the young woman beside him. Chapter 28 Calculation. At a mansion within the Northern Duke's estate, several young men and women in their 20s were sitting around a round sandalwood table placed inside a small pavilion, chatting and laughing together. Among them, a beautiful woman gently fiddled with a piece of raw jade in her hand and smiled, saying, Brother Jake, is this white jade truly the mystic star gem produced from the heavenly Fate Valley? Of course it is, Princess Susan. When have I, Fatty Paul, ever lied to you? Replied a tall, handsome, slightly chubby young man sitting across from her. He fanned himself with a folding fan in hand, laughing heartily. The other young men and women around them gazed intently at the white jade in Princess Susan's hand, their faces filled with admiration. Sister Susan, Brother Jake treats you so well. You two are truly a perfect match, talented and beautiful, destined to be together. I bet the Duke's family will come with a marriage proposal soon, a younger girl said with a smile. Princess Susan immediately blushed, shyly responding, Don't talk nonsense. Who would marry this chubby guy? Ha ha, Princess Susan is blushing. Everyone burst into laughter. They were all close friends of Jake Paul and Susan Blake, and knew that Fatty Paul had liked Princess Susan since childhood. Whenever they were together, they would often tease the two of them. Jake Paul, of course, harbored hopes of becoming a couple with Princess Susan. Instead of being annoyed by the teasing, he secretly encouraged everyone to make even more noise. Jake Paul was generous, well-versed in understanding women's preferences, and adept at winning hearts. However, Susan Blake's attitude remained ambiguous, her thoughts impossible to decipher. This time, he managed to acquire a premium Mystic Star gem from his father, and hurriedly went to the Northern Duke's residence to express his sincerity. Naturally, he didn't forget to bring along his friends, putting on a show of grandeur. All right, everyone, stop causing trouble. Jake Paul, seeing Princess Susan's shy demeanor, felt immense affection and quickly stepped in to mediate. These people had come with the intention to stir things up, but when Fatty Paul spoke, they knew better than to continue. Sensing the timing, they exchanged glances and began making excuses to leave. I just remembered, my father has some tasks for me. I must take my leave, one said. Watching everyone find reasons to depart, the corners of Susan Blake's lips curled into a faint smile. She knew this was Jake Paul's deliberate arrangement to create an opportunity for them to be alone. However, she didn't expose him. Instead, she lowered her head, pretending to be bashful. Moments later, everyone had left, leaving only Jake Paul and Susan Blake behind. Susan! Jake Paul boldly grabbed Susan Blake's soft hand, calling her name with emotion. Jake, don't let others see us, Susan Blake said shyly. Though she spoke those words, she didn't pull her hand away. Who else is around here? Fatty Paul, emboldened, moved closer to Susan Blake, inhaling her fragrance and praising. Susan, you smell amazing. Stop it! Susan Blake felt a wave of mature masculinity envelop her, causing her body to instinctively stiffen. Susan, don't you like me? Jake Paul asked with a flattering smile, leaning closer, his body brushing against her arm. Susan Blake felt a tinge of annoyance in her heart, but remembered she still had a favor to ask of this plump man today. After a moment of hesitation, she finally said, Jake, don't you already know my feelings? But we're not ordinary people. We can't cross certain boundaries. If you truly love me, then have your father come to my family to propose marriage. After speaking, Susan Blake thought to herself, a toad dreaming of eating swan meat. Even if your father came to propose, would I ever agree? Today, this princess merely intends to use you for my own ends, giving you a little taste of sweetness in the process. Susan. Jake Paul, caressing Susan Blake's delicate hand, was overjoyed. For a moment, he was at a loss for words and simply stood there dazed. For a long time, seeing Jake Paul remain motionless, Susan Blake felt a bit anxious and quickly said, You wouldn't possibly refuse, would you? Not at all, I wouldn't dare. Jake Paul hurriedly waved his hand and replied, It's just that I'm so overjoyed that I don't even know what to say. Susan Blake secretly sighed in relief, but felt slightly annoyed. Usually, this chatterbox Jake Paul could talk endlessly about anything under the sun. Yet at such a crucial moment, he turned into a mute, which was truly frustrating. Brother Jake, I heard that Virtue Keep is planning to recruit some talented disciples from our noble families to join their ranks. Are you aware of this? After a while, when she felt the atmosphere was just right, Susan Blake asked. Oh, that! I've heard about it, but it doesn't concern me. I have no intention of going to Virtue Keep to train or anything. Jake Paul nodded, but seemed uninterested in the matter. Well, if you really went to Virtue Keep, I'd have no choice but to marry someone else. Susan Blake teased, pretending to be upset. Compared to Virtue Keep, Susan, you are far more important. Jake Paul quickly responded. Just when things were going well, you start sweet-talking again. Susan Blake feigned annoyance, but soon furrowed her brows and asked, Brother Jake, do you still remember Ethan Blake? At the mention of Ethan Blake, Jake Paul's expression immediately darkened, and the scar on his calf seemed to throb. Gritting his teeth, he said, Of course I remember. If it weren't for the Duke stepping in back then, I would have settled the score with him long ago. Susan Blake nodded. Exactly. That Ethan Blake, ever since he came to our household, I found him insufferable. But Father protects him, so there's nothing we could do. What's even more infuriating is that Sophia, that wretched girl, sticks to him like glue every day. Moreover, I heard he's also planning to go to Virtue Keep. Just thinking about it makes me furious. Listening to Susan Blake's rant, Jake Paul couldn't help but recall the time he was stabbed by Ethan Blake. Grinding his teeth, he said, "If only I had the chance, I'd teach him a lesson." "Who says you don't have one?" Susan Blake's lips curled into a sly smile. "I just wonder if you dare to take it." "Me? Not dare?" Jake Paul raised his chin, his temper flaring as he loudly declared, "Susan, I can tolerate others looking down on me, but I can't let you do so. That orphan, why would I fear him? Even if I killed him, so what? If the Duke truly holds me accountable, my father would handle it. Tell me, what's the opportunity?" I knew my brother Jake is the best." Susan Blake immediately beamed, praising Jake Paul, though she secretly thought to herself how, despite his refined appearance, his true nature remained unchanged. "In a few days, it'll be the spring hunting season when Father will be away. That's the perfect opportunity." Jake Paul nodded, furrowing his brows in thought for a moment before saying, "Susan, I have plenty of ways to deal with him. The spring hunt is indeed a good chance, but whether that brat will attend is something we can't control." You're so silly, brother. Getting rid of him is not that hard. You don't need to worry about it. I have my own way. But when the time comes, it will depend on you." Susan Blake chuckled charmingly, deliberately leaning against Jake Paul. "Very well. Ethan Blake, they say a gentleman's revenge can wait 10 years, but the grudge between us has dragged on long enough." Jake Paul sneered, his hands wandering inappropriately over Susan Blake's mature figure. Though Susan Blake felt disgusted inside, she endured it to gain Fatty Paul's trust, thinking to herself, "It's just over a layer of clothing. Let him touch a bit." At the bright sun court, beside a small pond, Ethan Blake performed a fluid set of martial arts. His movements were like flowing water and drifting clouds, leaving him feeling invigorated, with his blood circulating smoothly and his spirit uplifted. "Virtue Keep, I must go to Virtue Keep to cultivate and become a true practitioner." Ethan Blake gazed at the rippling surface of the pond, recalling the news Princess Sophia had brought earlier that morning, silently vowing to himself. Now a young man, his appearance was entirely different from his childhood. Even if Henry Brooks were to see him, he might not recognize him. Moreover, Ethan no longer worried about suspicions arising from his name. So many years had passed that his ordinary name had likely been forgotten by everyone. As his thoughts wandered, he suddenly felt a burning sensation in his ears and muttered to himself, "I wonder who's talking about me." On second thought, within the Northern Duke's estate, the only person who might mention him was Sophia Blake. Although Owen Blake and his 3 brothers were friendly with him, their bond was purely brotherly, and unlikely to involve random thoughts about him. Recalling Sophia Blake's stunning beauty, Ethan Blake's heart fluttered. He couldn't help but murmur, "That girl is getting prettier by the day. Ethan Blake, young master." At this moment, Trucy and the 4 maidservants arrived together. Now in their 30s, all of them were married, and their husbands were also servants in the royal residence. Despite having families of their own and even children, they still took care of Ethan Blake's daily life. Among them, Trucy's husband was none other than Third Blake, who had once been frightened by Ethan Blake at the gates of the royal residence. "You've all arrived, sisters." Ethan Blake had never treated them as mere servants and always addressed them as sisters, a habit everyone had grown accustomed to. Trucy smiled and said, "Young Master Ethan Blake, you're so diligent in your training. Be careful not to overwork your body." Ha ha! Sister Trucy, you worry too much. Look at me. Over the years, my body has become much stronger thanks to my training. How could I harm myself? Ethan Blake laughed as he flexed his muscular frame. We, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. Young Master Ethan Blake is absolutely right. I remember when you first arrived, you were so frail and thin. Ethan Blake chuckled, wiping the sweat from his face with a towel. He turned to Trucy and asked, Sister Trucy, why haven't I seen Third Blake all morning? Him? He's out picking a horse for you. In a few days, it'll be time for the spring hunt. The Duke will be taking the young lords hunting, and you'll have to participate too. Trucy replied. The spring hunt? Is it that time already? Has another year passed so quickly? Ethan Blake had been at the Northern Duke's residence for 7 years, but had only participated in the spring hunt once. At that time, he was still a child and had merely been brought along to observe, with no chance to truly hunt. Now that he was grown, he figured he could ride across the grasslands and hunt fierce beasts himself. Perfect! This is a great opportunity to test my skills. Ethan Blake thought to himself, his face lighting up with excitement. Chapter 29. The Spring Hunt. In the far north, a year spanned 16 months, with winter alone stretching across 6 to 7 months. The remaining time is divided among spring, summer, and autumn. Therefore, early spring and late autumn are considered the ideal hunting seasons. Many nobles, aristocrats, and wealthy families often organize hunting trips with friends and relatives during these periods. However, these affluent elites naturally avoid venturing into deep forests or rugged mountains for hunting. Instead, they prefer plains filled with grass and trees, free from danger, where they can enjoy the pleasure of hunting while admiring the scenery, a truly refined pastime. When the Northern Duke organized a spring hunt, it was, of course, far more grandiose than others. At dawn, the entrance of the Duke's residence was already bustling with activity, an unusual sight of lively commotion. Besides the young noblemen invited to join, even the duchesses were dressed in practical attire, their slender waists accentuated, accompanied by their closest maidservants as they led their fine horses, waiting at the gate. According to routine, the Northern Duke would usually head to the palace before sunrise, discussing state affairs with the emperor, having breakfast there, and returning to his residence only after attending the morning court session. But today was an exception. Richard Blake had instructed everyone to wait at the gate before he left, as he planned to visit the palace to offer his apologies to the emperor and then return immediately. At the gate, people enjoyed the refreshing spring breeze, chatting with acquaintances, mostly recounting past hunting experiences, boasting about their bravery, how they shot multiple rabbits or deer with a single arrow, and so on. Everyone exaggerated their stories, as no one wanted to spoil the fun. Ethan Blake stood amidst the crowd, accompanied by Third Blake. The master and servant duo rarely left the ethereal young institute, and seldom interacted with others in the residence. Especially Ethan Blake, who was largely ignored by everyone around him. The identity of Ethan Blake had been a topic of speculation within the Northern Duke's estate for the past 7 or 8 years. One prevailing theory suggested that Ethan Blake might be the illegitimate son of the Northern Duke himself. However, as it was inconvenient for the Duke to acknowledge this publicly, he claimed that Ethan was the child of a close friend. This was also the reason why the delicate Duchess harbored resentment toward Ethan Blake. Being the pampered daughter of an official family, the Duchess possessed a strong sense of jealousy. She loved the Duke deeply, fearing that someone might steal his affection. Over time, however, she realized that while the Duke cared for Ethan Blake attentively, he rarely summoned him, which gradually eased her wariness. Instead, she began to help Ethan avoid many troubles. Third Blake led 2 sleek black horses, and softly explained to Ethan Blake the important points to note during the spring hunt. Ethan listened attentively. Whenever significant events occurred in the Duke's estate, Third Blake would always guide him through the rules to avoid any missteps. Suddenly, Ethan felt a cold gaze sweep over him, causing him to pause slightly. He looked up to see a tall, slightly overweight young man gently fanning himself with a folding fan, his dagger-like eyes fixed intently on Ethan. Standing beside the young man was none other than Princess Susan, who had always despised Ethan Blake. Ethan frowned slightly, turned away, and thought to himself, "Has that fat Jake Paul grown this tall? I'd better be cautious. Who knows if he still holds a grudge over the knife incident 7 years ago? Brother Ethan, come over here with us." At that moment, Owen Blake waved to Ethan from another side, his 3 other brothers smiling warmly. Adjusting his attire, Ethan walked toward Owen Blake, leaving Third Blake standing where he was, as leading the horses through the crowd would have been inappropriate. "Ha ha, Brother Ethan, you finally decided to join us for the spring hunt this year. This time, the 4 of us brothers will hunt together, bring back plenty of game, and have the chef prepare a feast to savor," said Connor Blake, laughing heartily before Owen Blake could speak. Among the 4 brothers, their personalities matched their names. Owen Blake had a refined appearance, eloquent speech, and was already a renowned scholar in the Wu Kingdom, destined to enter the court and become a national advisor in the future. Connor Blake, in complete contrast to his eldest brother, was tall, burly, and coarse in demeanor, with a rough way of speaking. He was born with the appearance of a warrior, and had a straightforward, hearty personality. As for Sonny Blake and Randy Blake, because they were still young and their personalities had not yet fully developed, they already faintly exuded an extraordinary aura, befitting descendants of nobility and generals. Compared to them, Ethan Blake appeared more reserved, resembling an ordinary family's child. He clasped his hands together and addressed the 4 of them, saying, "Ethan Blake greets eldest brother, second brother, third brother, and 4th brother." Owen Blake smiled and said, "Brother Ethan, it seems you've almost turned into a reclusive young lady who never leaves her chambers these past years." Big brother jests. "I simply enjoy peace and quiet and avoid unnecessary commotion whenever possible," Ethan Blake replied tactfully, earning an approving nod from Owen Blake. For someone Ethan's age, to exhibit such composure and maturity was indeed rare. "Ha ha, Brother Ethan, it's fine with others, but we're brothers. We should interact more often. It would be a shame to let our childhood bond go to waste," Connor Blake said enthusiastically, throwing an arm around Ethan Blake's shoulder. On the day Ethan Blake had been sent flying by Jake Paul, Connor Blake had stepped in without hesitation to help, even though Ethan had ultimately resolved the situation himself. That act of loyalty, however, remained etched in Ethan's heart. "Second brother, please be gentler. How could Ethan Blake endure your bear-like embrace?" At that moment, Sophia Blake, dressed in elegant velvet attire, strode out confidently, her striking presence immediately drawing many admiring gazes. She raised her fair, slender neck proudly and walked directly to Ethan Blake, pushing Connor Blake's arm aside with a cold huff of disapproval. Connor Blake froze for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Right, Brother Ethan has our little princess to protect him. Who needs an older brother like me?" Ethan Blake and Sophia Blake both blushed, about to explain themselves, when the sound of galloping hooves echoed from the end of the long road. The northern frontier duke, Richard Blake, and a sturdy young man rode swiftly toward them. Instantly, all eyes turned in that direction. Ethan Blake couldn't help but look as well, his heart suddenly skipping a beat. The faint smile on his face froze. The young man riding alongside Richard Blake was none other than the renowned prodigy of Virtue Keep, Henry Brooks. "Why is he here?" Ethan Blake's heart raced with unease. He quickly lowered his head, his mind whirling as he tried to guess whether Henry Brooks would recognize him. The Northern Frontier Duke and Henry Brooks dismounted in front of the crowd, Richard Blake letting out a hearty laugh. "Apologies for keeping everyone waiting. I've already informed His Majesty. Let us set off. But before that, allow me to introduce a dear friend." Turning to Henry Brooks, Richard Blake continued, "This is the outstanding young talent of Virtue Keep, Henry Brooks. I believe many of you have heard of him. In a few months, Virtue Keep will be selecting disciples with exceptional potential from the noble families of our Wu Kingdom to join their sect and cultivate the path of immortality. Brother Ming and I have long been acquainted, so Henry has come early to assist me in assessing the candidates." As Richard Blake spoke, his gaze swept over the young nobles. When his eyes landed on Ethan Blake, who had his head lowered and was hiding behind Connor Blake, his brows furrowed slightly before he quickly looked away. Henry Brooks, with his strikingly handsome features and profound cultivation, exuded an aura that set him apart. His presence captivated the young princesses, their hearts fluttering as they were drawn to his charm. Even the older duchesses, still elegant and poised, couldn't help but secretly admire him, marveling at how this young man truly stood out as a dragon among men. With a gentle smile, clearly enjoying the admiration directed his way, Henry Brooks remained seated on his horse and clasped his hands in greeting. "I am Henry Brooks. My sudden arrival may have disrupted your gathering. I hope it hasn't dampened the mood." "How could it, sir? We are honored by your presence," a flattering voice immediately chimed in. A young nobleman stepped forward, his sycophantic tone earning disdainful glances from those around him, who silently cursed his shamelessness. Unbothered by the reactions, the young man pushed through the crowd to stand before Henry Brooks's horse. Grabbing the reins, he said with an ingratiating smile, "Allow me to lead your horse, sir." Immediately, everyone felt like vomiting. "Enough. Let's not waste any more time. Let's set off for the hunting grounds in West Cloud Mountain." The Northern Duke waved his hand and led the way, urging his horse forward. Instantly, a long procession of people moved through the streets, heading out of the Grand Capital. West Cloud Mountain, located 70 miles from the Grand Capital, had flat rocky terrain, abundant grass, and sparse trees. It was home to wildlife like pheasants and mountain hares, with no significant dangers, making it an ideal spot for spring hunting. The Northern Duke's spring hunting trips typically lasted 5 or 6 days, during which he camped in the wilderness, living a primitive lifestyle while enjoying the natural scenery. Naturally, the group brought along chefs and complete cooking equipment, as well as a 50-soldier unit to ensure everyone's safety. Including family members and noble heirs invited to join, the spring hunting party totaled 150 people. Following them were several horse-drawn carts carrying supplies for the days ahead. The grand procession leaving the city drew countless curious gazes from the townsfolk, who recognized it as the Northern Duke's annual spring hunt. While they were no longer surprised by the sight, their attention often lingered on the noble women and young ladies, admiring their beauty. Not far from the Grand Capital lay an unremarkable small hill, which became a topic of conversation among the group as they pointed and commented on it. However, Ethan Blake's eyes gleamed with excitement, because that small hill was the hiding place of Snowy. Over the past 7 years, he had only managed to sneak out of the city 3 times to visit and deeply missed Snowy. "When I return, I must find a way to see Snowy," Ethan Blake thought to himself. The large group, numbering over 100, traveled intermittently and only reached the base of West Cloud Mountain by late afternoon. With nightfall approaching, hunting was out of the question. They busied themselves setting up camp, lighting fires, and preparing dinner, planning to rest for the night, and begin the spring hunt early the next morning. That evening, Ethan Blake shared a large tent with his 4 brothers, including Owen Blake. Yet, No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't sleep, his mind preoccupied with wondering whether Henry Brooks had recognized him or not. Tossing and turning, unable to sleep, he restlessly got up, stepped out of the tent, and took a deep breath of the fresh, distinctive mountain air, finally calming his mind. Looking up, he saw the full moon high above and murmured to himself, "The Duke really knows how to choose a day. So today is the 15th of the first lunar month." While Ethan Blake was gazing at the moon and talking to himself, a petite and lovely figure quietly approached him from behind, raising her hand slightly towards Ethan Blake's head. "Who's there?" Ethan Blake, having practiced the Codex of Might for a long time, had sharp senses and immediately sensed someone behind him. He shouted loudly, turned around, and instinctively struck towards the opponent's chest without even looking. In an instant, Ethan Blake felt his hand press against something soft and slightly elastic. Alarmed, he internally exclaimed that something was wrong. Before he could withdraw his hand, a startled cry of "Ah!" rang out, and the figure stumbled backward. "Ethan Blake, you're bullying me!" "Boo-hoo!" Sophia Blake's sobbing voice echoed. Chapter 30, Taming the Tiger. "Princess Sophia, I truly didn't mean it. Please don't be mad anymore." Sophia Blake's face remained cold, as her small hands angrily clutched the hem of her robe. No matter how sweetly Ethan Blake tried to coax her, she paid him no attention, her tearful eyes brimming with grievance. Her expression was pitifully sad. Ethan Blake, on the other hand, was in a panic, pacing back and forth. Normally, the two would quarrel noisily, and occasional physical contact was brushed off without much thought. However, when it came to a young lady's private areas, such matters were to be avoided at all costs. Yet, just moments ago, he had accidentally touched Sophia Blake's chest. He was utterly mortified. Seeing Ethan Blake scratching his head in a fluster, Sophia Blake suddenly burst into laughter. She pushed him lightly and said, "Ethan Blake, I'll remember this debt. I'll settle it with you later." Hearing this, Ethan Blake secretly sighed in relief and chuckled, saying, "Princess Sophia, it's already so late. Why aren't you asleep? What are you doing wandering around?" "Humph." Sophia Blake snorted and replied, "You heartless oaf, I came here on purpose to find you. I saw you sneaking outside the tent and wanted to scare you a little. Who would have thought?" As she spoke, her beautiful face flushed a deep red, and under the pure white moonlight, she looked even more enchanting. "You came here specifically to find me?" Ethan Blake withdrew his gaze from the princess and asked, "Of course. If not to find you, why would I be out here in the middle of the night?" Sophia Blake glared at him irritably before furrowing her brows and continuing, "Ethan Blake, have you offended my sister Susan again lately? I've been hiding in the Rising Sun courtyard every day, practicing martial arts. Where would I find the time to offend her?" Speaking of Susan Blake, Ethan Blake felt a bit annoyed, but as he grew older, he had learned better how to conceal his emotions. "That's odd then. During dinner, I overheard my sister Susan and my brother Jake mentioning you, but their voices were so low I couldn't make out what they were plotting." Sophia Blake tilted her head and said with a hint of worry. Ethan Blake took a deep breath, pondered for a moment, and said, "Princess Sophia, thank you for telling me this." Recalling the cold gaze Jake Paul had given him that morning as he left the house, a faint unease began to rise in Ethan Blake's heart. The next morning, as dawn broke, the camp echoed with the neighing of horses. Everyone was ready to set off. The northern frontier duke, Richard Blake, donned dark gold armor, holding a massive bow in his hand. A quiver filled with cold iron arrows hung on his saddle, exuding an aura of dominance that commanded respect and awe. "Move out!" Richard Blake raised his massive bow high, letting out a thunderous shout that shook the heavens, as if ready to charge into battle. Tugging at the reins, he was the first to gallop out of the camp. Behind him, the noble sons cheered enthusiastically, spurring their horses to follow. Each of them, atop their steeds, radiated the heroic spirit of young men. Trailing behind these men were the noble ladies, riding their beloved horses at a leisurely pace, more interested in enjoying the scenery than the hunt. Beside them, personal guards ensured their safety, leaving no room for danger. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Arrows sliced through the air, instantly pinning a plump rabbit on the grassy field. A servant quickly rode over, retrieved the arrow along with the rabbit, and raised it high, shouting, "Your Grace, another hit! A big one this time!" "Ha ha!" Richard Blake, still on horseback, laughed heartily, and turned to the four brothers of the Blake family riding behind him. "Which of you wants to give it a try?" Owen Blake waved his hands repeatedly, saying, "Father, please spare me. How could I possibly draw that mighty bow? Let the second brother have a go instead." "Humph." Richard Blake snorted and handed his massive bow to Connor Blake. "Connor, shoot a few hares for your father." "Yes, father." Connor Blake, eager to show off, happily took the massive bow, spurred his horse, and galloped forward. Just then, a snow-white rabbit darted out from the woods nearby. Overjoyed, Connor decided to display his skills. Leaping into the air, he performed a graceful mid-air spin, drew the bow, and nocked an arrow. With a sharp whoosh, a cold streak of light shot out, hitting the white rabbit with precision. Connor landed lightly back on his horse, swung the massive bow onto his shoulder, tugged at the reins, and his horse neighed loudly, galloping forward once more. "Brother Ming, how about my son?" Watching Connor Blake charge ahead, Richard Blake, brimming with pride, asked Henry Brooks beside him. Henry Brooks casually smiled and said, "Your Highness, the second young master's movements are graceful, his arms strong and full of vigor, truly a talent for martial arts." "Oh!" Richard Blake froze for a moment, looking at Henry Brooks with a meaningful gaze before asking, "Then how would he fare in cultivating the path of immortality? The immortal path is vast and unfathomable, beyond what ordinary people can imagine. Relying on mere physical strength is far from sufficient." Henry Brooks shook his head and replied. Richard Blake frowned, feeling a tinge of displeasure. However, considering that Henry Brooks was the rising star of Virtue Keep, with a transcendent status, and the potential to one day lead Virtue Keep as a dominant figure, far surpassing the prestige of his own position as a prince of a small kingdom, he dared not show any offense. He could only swallow his frustration and silently wonder, does this mean that no one in this world is capable of cultivating the immortal path? Roar. At that moment, a tiger's roar suddenly echoed from afar. The roar of a king of the forest sent waves of terror through the area, causing even the horses to whinny in panic, sensing the impending danger. Everyone's expressions changed drastically. Owen Blake shouted loudly, "Father, second brother is in danger. Why is there a fierce tiger on Western Literary Mountain?" Richard Blake was alarmed, urging his horse to gallop forward. The guards beside him wasted no time, closely following behind. However, at the critical moment, everyone only saw a blur before their eyes, a black shadow streaking past them like lightning, heading straight toward Connor Blake's location. Young Master Ethan Blake. Third Blake, who had been accompanying Ethan Blake and watching the commotion, was stunned. As soon as the tiger's roar echoed, Ethan Blake had already spurred his horse into a wild dash. Third Blake clearly saw that behind the black steed, a trail of blood sprayed out. Shocked, he realized that Ethan Blake had stabbed the horse's flank with a blade, causing it pain and frenzy, which made it charge forward fearlessly despite the tiger's threat. Connor Blake, after shooting down a rabbit, was overjoyed and wanted to show off in front of his father. He urged his horse to chase after it, but suddenly, from the tall grass that reached his waist, a green shadow flashed by. Thinking it was some prey, he gave chase. To his regret, the green shadow turned out to be a fierce tiger with an emerald green body, its sharp fangs exposed, looking terrifyingly ferocious. This type of tiger was called the Jade Emerald Wind Tiger, a unique species native to the forest of 10,000 beasts in the southern continent. It was exceedingly fierce, bloodthirsty, and aggressive, often traveling alone. It was an extraordinarily rare predator. It was just the origin place of this beast, thousands of miles away from the Wu Kingdom. How could it appear here? Connor Blake tried to recall everything he knew about the Jade Green Tiger. His heart was gripped with intense fear, and he wanted to turn his horse around and flee. However, he discovered that the horse he was riding had its legs trembling and was lying flat on the ground, refusing to move. Roar! The Jade Green Tiger stared at Connor Blake with bloodshot eyes, drool dripping incessantly from its mouth as it flicked its barbed tongue in and out, clearly showing its intent to devour him alive. Damn it! With the horse immobilized, Connor Blake couldn't just sit and wait for death. He flipped off the saddle, drew his bow, and aimed at the Jade Green Tiger. If it made any sudden movements, he would shoot immediately. Roar! The Jade Green Tiger let out a low growl, slowly lowering its head, while locking its gaze on Connor Blake, advancing step by step. Don't come any closer, don't. Connor Blake's voice trembled with a sob, and his arms began to shake slightly. Whoosh! A predator pouncing on its prey. The Jade Green Tiger suddenly sprang into action, moving like a green flash, vanishing from Connor Blake's sight. In the next moment, Connor felt a strong gust of wind beside him as the Jade Green Tiger lunged forward. If Connor Blake had been holding a short sword, he might have stood a chance to threaten the beast. But in his hands was a massive bow, powerful, yet cumbersome and unwieldy. There was no time to react. The stench of the tiger's breath hit his face, and within the blink of an eye, he was on the brink of death. Why is the Jade Green Tiger here? Connor Blake shut his eyes, bracing himself to become nothing more than a meal for the beast. Thud, thud, thud. At the critical moment, 3 dull thuds rang out, followed by a heavy crash, as if something massive had fallen to the ground. Curious, Connor Blake opened his eyes, and was instantly stunned. In front of him stood a figure, and the once ferocious Jade Green Tiger was struggling to get up, staring intently at the person standing between it and Connor Blake. Ethan Blake shook his wrist, feeling the numbness subside slightly, before saying, "Beast, 3 punches weren't enough for you, huh? Fine, this is a good chance to test just how strong I really am." Moments earlier, Ethan Blake had delivered 3 consecutive punches that forced the ferocious tiger to retreat. He now had a preliminary understanding of his strength. If he could defeat the Jade Green Tiger before him, it would prove that he had reached the level of subduing such a beast. Subduing a tiger was the sole method of certifying one's mastery at this stage. With that, Ethan Blake calmly advanced toward the Jade Green Tiger. With each step, his aura grew more imposing. The tiger, sensing danger, crouched low like a drawn bow, ready to strike. "Take this punch," Ethan Blake said, seizing the opportunity to gather power within his body as he moved forward. Having read about the Jade Green Tiger's ferocity, he dared not underestimate it. When he judged the moment was right, he let out a loud shout and charged at the beast. Roar! The Jade Green Tiger bellowed and lunged forward. Man and tiger clashed fiercely, their blows landing with resounding thuds. At this moment, Richard Blake, the Northern Warden, arrived with his men. Witnessing the scene before them, they collectively gasped. Some soldiers moved to assist, but Richard Blake raised a hand, signaling them to hold back and observe. "Still not dead?" Ethan Blake's voice rang out amidst the chaotic battle, followed by a barrage of punches raining down on the Jade Green Tiger. Roar! The tiger howled in pain, its sharp claws slashing wildly, leaving bloody wounds on Ethan Blake's body and tearing his clothes. "Father, help brother Ethan quickly!" Connor Blake shouted urgently, when he saw that Richard Blake had no intention of intervening. "Heh. I doubt Ethan wants our help. Though he looks a bit battered, that jade green tiger is already at a disadvantage," Richard Blake replied, his eyes narrowing as he thought to himself. "Ethan Blake is remarkable. In just 7 short years, he's achieved so much. I truly wasn't wrong about him back then." Among the crowd, Jake Paul's eyes gleamed with malice as he thought, "What are these fools doing? Weren't they supposed to wait until Ethan Blake arrived before releasing the jade green tiger? Why release it early? No matter. This brat will die in the tiger's jaws anyway." As he reveled in his sinister thoughts, he suddenly heard Richard Blake's comment. Curious, he looked over, only for his expression to change drastically. Chapter 31, Explosion. Jade green tiger is a ferocious beast native to the forest of 10,000 beasts in the southern continent. Its massive body and aggressive nature make it fearsome. Each pounce carries the weight of 1,000 pounds. Its tiger tail, like a whip, can snap trees and crack stones, possessing strength that even dozens of men combined cannot rival. Ethan Blake resided deep within the Northern Duke's estate. Not only did he practice the Codex of Might to train his body, but he also spent his leisure time reading books, gaining knowledge about rare birds and fierce beasts across the world. Hearing the tiger's roar echo through the mountains and forests, he immediately sensed danger. Second young Master Connor Blake might very well be in mortal peril. While others might not matter as much, the 4 Blake siblings had always shared a close bond with him. Over the years, they had cared for him deeply. Margaret Snow's teachings from years past remained etched in his heart. If someone gives you a drop of kindness, you must repay them with a fountain of gratitude. How could he ignore the Blake brothers, who treated him like true family? Without hesitation, Ethan drew his short blade and stabbed it fiercely into his horse's flank. The steed beneath him, a 1,000-mile stallion with a fiery temperament, felt the sharp pain from behind and immediately erupted in fury, charging forward through the crowd. Having trained in the Codex of Might for a long time, and once benefiting from the potent effects of the Genesis elixir, Ethan's physique had long surpassed that of ordinary people. Combined with the unparalleled wonders of the Codex of Might, his muscles, bones, and skin had been tempered to extraordinary levels. Even as the enraged stallion beneath him went wild, he relied on his own strength to maintain control, avoiding being thrown off. The horse galloped like lightning, arriving in the blink of an eye. Ethan Blake saw the jade green tiger lunging toward Connor Blake. It seemed there was no way to avoid it. All he could do was close his eyes and await death. Ethan Blake immediately leaped off the horse, launching 3 punches midair. Each of these punches carried an incredible force, enough to shatter mountains and split stones. They struck the jade green tiger, producing a thunderous sound that sent the beast, glowing with a jade-green radiance, flying through the air. Ethan Blake landed gently on the ground, but felt a slight numbness in his arms, prompting him to shake them out with some effort. He had trained diligently every day and knew he had grown much stronger, but he still wasn't entirely sure of his limits. In that critical moment, he unleashed his full strength, driving back the ferocious tiger with 3 punches. Only now did he have a clearer sense of his own abilities. His current strength was just a step away from the level described in the Codex of Might as taming the tiger. If he had reached that level, those 3 punches alone would have been enough to kill the jade-green tiger outright. Unfortunately, I'm still slightly short of the tiger taming level. Ethan Blake sighed inwardly. Yet, he couldn't hide a trace of satisfaction. He was no longer the frail child he once was, but was steadily advancing on the path to becoming a formidable warrior. At this moment, the jade-green tiger struggled to its feet. The beast weighed over 1,000 pounds, its entire body packed with solid muscle. Though the 3 punches had hurt it, they weren't enough to seriously harm it. Instead, they only seemed to provoke its savage instincts further. Its body coiled, and it lunged once more. Ethan Blake showed no fear. Channeling his strength into his arms, he launched another punch. Boom! 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 2 more punches landed on the belly of the jade-green tiger, as Ethan Blake used the momentum of his strikes to evade its lunge. However, the jade-green tiger's claws were as sharp as blades. The mere gust of wind from its swipe tore through Ethan Blake's clothing, even slashing the skin underneath. Fresh blood splattered everywhere. The scent of blood ignited the ferocity of the jade-green tiger. Its body twisted midair, and its tail, like an iron whip, lashed viciously toward Ethan Blake. Boom! This was Ethan Blake's first real battle, and he had no experience to rely on. Adding to that, the pain from his wounds was excruciating. Just after narrowly dodging the tiger's pounce, he barely had time to catch his breath before feeling the force of a powerful gust rushing toward him. Unable to dodge in time, he instinctively twisted his body, taking the full brunt of the attack on his back. The impact sent him flying, rolling several meters across the grass before he sprang back to his feet, spitting out a mouthful of blood. Roar! Roar! The jade-green tiger, emboldened by its successful strike, charged forward like a storm. In mere moments, it closed the distance of several meters, leaping with its jaws wide open. Its razor-sharp fangs gleamed coldly as it aimed for Ethan Blake's throat. A fierce determination surged in Ethan Blake's heart. This time, he didn't dodge. Instead, he opened his arms and thrust his hands directly into the tiger's mouth, gripping its fangs tightly. Using the tiger's momentum, he fell backward, managing to avoid having his neck bitten through. Despite the life-threatening danger, he had successfully defused the immediate threat. The intense battle between man and beast unfolded in mere moments. Just as Ethan Blake was tackled to the ground, the sound of chaotic horse hooves approached. Following this was Connor Blake shouting for help, but the northern warlord uttered something unexpected. At this moment, Ethan Blake didn't want anyone's assistance. Instead, a glimmer of admiration appeared in his eyes. Among the crowd, Jake Paul wore a smug expression, clearly hoping Ethan Blake would be devoured by the jade-green tiger, finally satisfying the grudge he had held onto for years. Yet, in the very next moment, Jake Paul's face transformed into one of utter shock. Ethan Blake was seen being pounced on by the jade-green tiger, but he quickly flipped the ferocious beast, pinning him down. In his hands were 2 broken fangs, his demeanor fierce and unyielding as he relentlessly stabbed toward the jade-green tiger. It turned out that, in that brief moment, Ethan Blake unleashed extraordinary strength, snatching the fangs from the tiger's jaws and snapping them in one swift motion. The jade-green tiger, flipped onto its back, had no time to recover before the sharp fangs were plunged into its abdomen. Without mercy, Ethan Blake mounted its back, raining down punches like a torrential storm, all aimed at its head. The thunderous sounds of impact made the hearts of the northern frontier king and his entourage pound uncontrollably. Ethan Blake's body was covered in blood, resembling a blood-soaked demon, seemingly teetering on the edge of losing control. Is this the power of the Genesis elixir? Ethan Blake's blood surged through his veins as this overwhelming question echoed in his mind. In that fleeting moment, Ethan felt a violent surge of heat coursing through his body, merging with his bloodstream and spreading rapidly. His strength abruptly doubled, and even the muscle pain from battling the jade-green tiger and exerting immense force vanished entirely. However, the heat within him grew more intense, surpassing the flow of his blood. The fleeting comfort he had just experienced disappeared, replaced by searing pain that seemed to penetrate his very bones, as though his veins were on the verge of bursting. The power within him continued to swell uncontrollably, like an overfilled balloon, threatening to explode at any moment. Bang! 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 Only by continuously throwing punches and releasing that overwhelming energy could he find a slight reprieve. Everyone's eyes were filled with disbelief as they noticed Ethan Blake's punches were growing slower, yet his entire body was emanating a strange crimson glow. Looking closer, they realized it was not light at all, but a faint mist of blood rising from Ethan Blake's skin. Not good, Ethan is in danger. Richard Blake, the Duke of the Northern Frontier, who was still seated on horseback, noticed the unusual occurrence. His expression changed drastically as he leaped off his horse, landing directly in front of Ethan Blake, reaching out to grab Ethan's arm. Boom! The moment Richard Blake touched Ethan Blake's body, an overwhelming force surged forth like a collapsing mountain, throwing him backward. Your Grace, let me handle this. As the Duke was sent flying, Henry Brooks's voice rang out. His figure moved so swiftly that no one could see what had happened. In an instant, he caught Richard Blake midair, then disappeared from sight, reappearing moments later in front of Ethan Blake. Not bad, a master at the tiger-subduing realm, worthy of entering Virtue Keep. Henry Brooks opened his palm, revealing a bronze mirror that began to spin. He directed the mirror toward Ethan Blake, and a beam of light shot out, enveloping Ethan entirely. Immediately, the blood mist surrounding Ethan began to dissipate. His body trembled before collapsing to the ground. Looking at the jade-green tiger beneath him, its skull was shattered. It was undeniably dead. Retrieving the bronze mirror, Henry Brooks crouched down to examine Ethan Blake's condition. Then, raising his head, he said, Your Grace, this young man is fine. He just needs a few days of rest. Richard Blake let out a sigh of relief, quickly stepping forward. He bowed slightly to Henry Brooks and said, Brother Ming, thank you for your help. Without you, I don't know what would have happened to Ethan. Henry Brooks smiled and replied, Your Grace, there's no need for such words. In the future, I may need to rely on your support. Ha, that goes without saying. Richard Blake's heart stirred slightly as he thought to himself. Henry Brooks indeed has ambitions to compete for the position of Virtue Keep's sect master. While noble families rely on the sects to establish their status and dominance in the secular world, becoming regional overlords. The sects, in turn, need the support of noble families to provide them with abundant resources, enabling them to cultivate peacefully and pursue enlightenment of the grand path. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. Anyone vying for the position of sect master must garner support from worldly powers. Without delay, Richard Blake ordered his men to lift Ethan Blake onto a horse and clean up the corpse of the jade-green tiger. The jade-green tiger was incredibly fierce, but its body was adorned with treasures. How could one possibly discard it? Henry Brooks was truly a dragon among men. With just a single sentence, he revealed his thoughts, but didn't dwell on the matter further. Instead, he asked, Your Highness, may I ask, which noble house does this young master belong to? Richard Blake was momentarily stunned. Seeing Henry Brooks' gaze fixed intently on him, he immediately understood and replied, He is the heir of my Blake family. His name is Ethan Storm. That day, when Ethan Blake came to serve under him, he had mentioned being hunted down by Henry Brooks in the past. Now that Henry Brooks had arrived, Richard Blake felt uneasy. However, Ethan Blake had grown and matured, making him difficult to recognize. To Richard's relief, Henry Brooks did not recognize Ethan Blake. At this moment, when Henry Brooks inquired about Ethan Blake's identity, Richard naturally couldn't reveal the truth. He had no choice but to fabricate a lie to deflect the situation. Ethan Storm. Henry Brooks nodded thoughtfully before saying, Your Highness, this young man under your care has remarkable potential. At such a young age, He has already achieved the tiger's subduing realm. He shows great promise. For this round of Virtue Keep disciple selections, I will recommend him. Is that true? Richard Blake's eyes lit up immediately. He knew that having a great cultivator within the royal estate would elevate their status significantly, not only in the mortal world but also within the celestial realms. Would your highness doubt my words? Henry Brooks smiled. Of course not. Richard Blake quickly nodded. Yet, a trace of melancholy crept into his heart. After all, Ethan Blake was not his biological son. If Ethan were to achieve great success in the future and forget the bonds of the past, the loss would outweigh the gain. No matter what, he had to ensure one of his own bloodline entered Virtue Keep as well. Thinking of this, he immediately said, Brother Ming, forgive me for being greedy. My second son, Connor Blake, has been devoted to the past since childhood and is diligent in his studies. I wonder if you could give me one more chance. Henry Brooks furrowed his brows slightly, hesitated for a moment, and then said, The Duke's request is, of course, something I must honor. However, I am currently still somewhat isolated in Virtue Keep. I would ask the Duke to guide your two sons so that when they enter Virtue Keep, they do not align themselves with the wrong faction. Ha ha, rest assured, Brother Ming. Not only do the two of them wish to follow you, but even I will spare no effort to assist you. Richard Blake understood the complexities of power struggles within sections. Henry Brooks, though young and capable of competing for the position of sect leader, lacked trusted allies compared to the older members of the sect. Naturally, he intended to seize this opportunity to recruit talents and spoke candidly. Before he could finish, Henry Brooks waved his hand and said, Your Grace, as long as we share mutual understanding, that's enough. Also, regarding Ethan earlier, his sudden outburst may have been caused by consuming potent medicinal pills. With his current physique, he is unable to fully refine them. You should remind him that such pills cannot be taken recklessly. If they damage his meridians, his future prospects will be bleak. Yes, I understand. Richard Blake nodded repeatedly. All right then, Your Grace. I have no interest in hunting, so I'll take my leave. There are still many noble families I must visit. Leaving an enigmatic remark, Henry Brooks stepped forward, and in an instant, a sword light surged. He soared into the sky upon it. This man is too cunning, always taking the chance to remind me of my shortcomings. Humph. If it weren't for what happened back then, my achievements might not have been inferior to his. Looking up at the sky, Richard Blake sighed deeply, his gaze tinged with a hint of desolation. Hashtag Chapter 32, The Plot to Harm. A sudden turn of events, though alarming, fortunately ended without major harm, causing everyone's enthusiasm for the hunt to dissipate entirely. Duke of Northern Frontier, Richard Blake, led the group back to the camp. On the way, they encountered the group of noble women moving at a leisurely pace. Seeing the Duke's stern expression, none dared to invite trouble, quietly following behind the procession while discreetly seeking someone familiar to gather information. Sophia Blake looked around anxiously, but couldn't spot Ethan Blake among the group. Concerned, she urged her horse closer to Owen Blake and asked softly, Elder brother, where is Ethan Blake? Owen Blake furrowed his brows, tugged at the reins to slow down, and maintained some distance from the Duke before replying in a low voice. Brother Ethan was just wrestling with a jade-green tiger. He's covered in wounds and has fallen unconscious. We're still unclear about his condition. What? A jade-green tiger? Why is there a jade-green tiger here? Where is Ethan Blake? I want to see him. Sophia Blake exclaimed anxiously, scanning her surroundings. Stop looking. Father has already sent people to escort Brother Ethan back to the camp. During the critical moment earlier, it was thanks to someone named Henry Brooks stepping in that Brother Ethan was saved. Otherwise, his fate would have been grim. Owen Blake sighed, recounting the earlier events to Sophia Blake. Though deeply worried, Sophia Blake dared not act recklessly. She could only suppress her anxiety, following the group slowly back to the camp. Meanwhile, Jake Paul wore a downcast expression. He never expected Ethan Blake to become so formidable, capable of grappling with a fully grown jade green tiger. "Hey, what's wrong?" Just as he was brooding, Susan Blake's voice sounded behind him. "Princess Susan." Jake Paul, who had confidently boasted earlier that he would teach Ethan Blake a lesson, now found himself unable to meet Susan Blake's gaze due to the unexpected turn of events. Susan Blake, clearly already aware of what had transpired, glared at Jake Paul in anger. Jake Paul wiped the sweat off his face and said in a low voice, "To deal with Ethan Blake, I specifically asked someone to find a jade green tiger. Initially, I planned to lure him away from the crowd while he was hunting, then release the tiger to devour him alive. Who would have thought those useless servants would release the beast prematurely and nearly injure the second prince?" Seeing Susan Blake frown, but her expression slightly soften, he quickly added, "Fortunately, Ethan Blake acted decisively. Although he managed to kill the jade green tiger, he was seriously injured. It will likely take him a year and a half to recover fully. This means Virtue Keep is now beyond his reach." Susan Blake nodded, biting her cherry lips. After a moment of silence, a glint of murderous intent flashed in her eyes. She deliberately moved her horse closer to Jake Paul and whispered, "While he's weakened, let's take his life. We might as well do it now." Hearing Susan Blake's plan, Jake Paul was shaken to the core, cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The group returned to the camp, and Richard Blake immediately went alone to Ethan Blake's quarters, where 10 soldiers guarded the entrance. Everyone was curious, but no one dared to ask questions. It wasn't until midday that Richard Blake emerged from Ethan Blake's tent and returned to his quarters. He then summoned everyone from the royal household and announced that, from this day forward, Ethan Blake would now be known as Ethan Storm. Under no circumstances were they to mention Ethan Blake's original name to anyone. Additionally, he sent word to the noble heirs traveling with them to ensure the secret would not be exposed later. He also declared that hunting would resume after lunch, completely ignoring the incident with the jade green tiger, as if it had never happened. Once everything was arranged, the group dispersed to prepare for lunch. The 4 siblings, Owen Blake and Sophia Blake among them, worried about Ethan Blake's condition and went to visit him at his quarters. When they arrived, they found Ethan Blake lying on a mat, his entire body wrapped in bandages, staring blankly. Sophia Blake gasped, rushing over with tears in her eyes. "Ethan Blake, are you all right?" Ethan Blake smiled and said, "Do I look like something's wrong? As for that jade green tiger, I wonder if it's truly dead yet." "Ha ha, brother Ethan, you truly surprised me. You were able to smash the head of that jade green tiger. I heard from some soldiers that such a feat can only be accomplished by someone whose martial arts have reached an extremely high level," Connor Blake said, laughing heartily as he approached. "Second brother, it's all your fault. If you hadn't been boasting, this wouldn't have happened," Sophia Blake said, feeling relieved now that Ethan Blake seemed unharmed. Upon hearing Connor Blake's words, she couldn't help but express her annoyance. Connor Blake scratched his head and replied, "How could I have known there'd be a jade green tiger in West Cloud Mountain? That creature is native to the southern continent, thousands of miles away from here. Who knows what it's doing here? Regardless, it's still your fault," Sophia Blake retorted, giving Connor Blake a sharp look before turning to Ethan Blake. "Ethan Blake, does it hurt? Come on, Sophia. Can't you see brother Ethan is still perfectly fine? Stop worrying so much," Owen Blake said with a smile, his eyes showing a doting affection. The brothers all deeply cared for their younger sister. Sophia Blake blushed, turned on her heel, and ran out of the tent. At the door, she shyly added, "Ethan Blake, once they leave this afternoon, I'll come back to visit you." With that, she left, her fragrance lingering in the air. Ethan Blake's expression turned slightly awkward as he helplessly glanced at the Blake brothers. After Sophia Blake had left, Owen Blake's smile faded, and he spoke in a serious tone. "Now that there's no one else around, let's have a private discussion, just us brothers. Brother Ethan, I have some doubts, and I think we should talk them through together." Everyone was stunned, except for Ethan Blake, who nodded and said, "I know what Big Brother wants to say. Just as second brother mentioned, South Continent is thousands of miles away from here, and the forest of 10,000 beasts, where the jade green tiger originates, is even further south of South Continent. How could it naturally appear on the outskirts of the Grand Capital?" Owen Blake nodded in agreement, gesturing for his three younger brothers to sit down before speaking. "Therefore, I suspect that the jade green tiger was deliberately released into the western Cloud Mountains, possibly targeting our father." Sonny Blake, slightly younger than his two older brothers, but equally sharp and quick-witted, immediately said, "Big Brother, although the jade green tiger is ferocious, our father brings many guards with him on his annual spring hunts. Moreover, he is a formidable warrior himself. A single jade green tiger might not be able to harm him." Owen Blake fell silent for a moment before responding. "Third brother is correct. If it's not targeting our father, then among the hunting party, we brothers are the only ones worthy of being potential targets." Everyone froze, their minds racing with silent speculation. In the Wu Kingdom, countless enemies harbored grudges against the Northern Guardian Duke. It wouldn't be surprising for someone to take advantage of the situation to deal with him. The Northern Guardian Duke was a renowned war general, and ordinary masters would not likely be able to harm him. As for the Taoist sects, they all knew that the powerful virtue keep stood behind the Northern Guardian Duke, so no one would dare act recklessly. However, targeting enemies doesn't always mean killing the commander. Bringing harm to their family is another tactic, especially when it involves the children of a noble family. Ethan Blake took a deep breath and said, "Big Brother's concerns are not unfounded. However, I believe that the jade green tiger was actually meant for me. I suspect the other side made a mistake, which caused the jade green tiger to appear prematurely." As soon as he said this, everyone was taken aback. Ethan Blake, though living in the Duke's residence, was an unremarkable figure. The Northern Guardian Duke's enemies wouldn't even know of his existence, so why would they target him? Owen Blake and the others all wore serious expressions, but Ethan Blake smiled and said, "Big Brother, you don't need to worry too much. The jade green tiger is extremely rare. There won't be a second one. This afternoon, you all should go ahead with the hunt." The four Blake brothers nodded silently, saying nothing further. After finishing lunch, the Northern Guardian Duke sat alone in the grand tent, furrowing his brows as though deep in thought. At that moment, hurried footsteps sounded outside the tent, followed by a voice calling out, "Your Grace, Princess Susan requests an audience. Let her in." The Northern Guardian Duke relaxed his brows and adjusted his attire. Even in front of his own children, he maintained an air of authority. The curtain was lifted, and Susan Blake entered. She bowed respectfully to the Northern Guardian Duke, her voice melodious like a nightingale's. "Daughter greets father." "Rise," Richard Blake said calmly. "Thank you, father." "Susan, coming here in such haste, what matter do you wish to discuss with me?" Richard Blake inquired. "Father, regarding the jade green tiger incident today, I have heard some news," Susan Blake replied leisurely. "Oh." Richard Blake raised an eyebrow. "Father, it has been rumored in our estate recently that Virtue Keep is selecting outstanding disciples from among the noble heirs to send to virtue keep for immortal cultivation. Today, Henry Brooks confirmed this. I fear the appearance of the jade green tiger is somehow connected to this matter. Why do you say so? Father, Virtue Keep is a prestigious sect in the immortal path, one that everyone aspires to join. Anyone would wish to enter such a sect and rise above others. That Ethan Blake is likely no exception. Richard Blake froze, his expression shifting slightly. He pressed his lips together, remaining silent as he stared intently at Susan Blake. Susan Blake's heart skipped a beat, but since the words had already been spoken, she could only grit her teeth and continue. Ethan Blake has been in our duchy for 7 years, yet he has left the estate without reason 3 times. Each time, he stayed outside for 2 or 3 days. Some people claim to have seen him entering an unnamed small mountain outside the grand capital, meeting with a ferocious beast. Seeing Richard Blake's expression soften slightly, Susan Blake breathed a small sigh of relief. I used to dismiss these incidents as mere jokes, but after today's events, I can't help but feel suspicious. Second brother encountered the jade green tiger, and naturally, there were guards present. Why would Ethan Blake need to intervene? Moreover, the jade green tiger is known for its ferocity. Even dozens of people working together might not subdue it. Only a martial arts master or a disciple of the immortal sects could possibly defeat it. Yet Ethan Blake managed to kill the jade green tiger alone. This is highly suspicious. Oh! Are you suggesting that Ethan colluded with the jade green tiger, staging a spectacle in front of me and Henry Brooks to draw our attention, paving the way for him to enter Virtue Keep? Richard Blake asked slowly. That is precisely what I mean. Furthermore, Susan Blake noticed her father's face suddenly turn stern, and a trace of fear crept into her heart, filling her with hesitation. Furthermore what? Richard Blake suddenly shouted. Father! Susan Blake stammered, dropping to her knees in fear. Her voice trembled as she said, Please, Father, calm your anger. These are merely my wild speculations. However, to verify the matter, I did inquire further. From Jake Paul, I learned that 2 days ago, he and several family members went to inspect the mountain and discovered that Third Blake, Ethan Blake's servant, had brought over a dozen strong men with him, transporting a massive iron cage by carriage. That is why I have my suspicions. Good. Very good. Richard Blake suddenly squinted. A sharp glint of golden light flashed in his eyes, as he slowly said, Susan, you're now over 20 this year. It's time for you to marry. Your father has chosen a good match for you. After the spring hunt, we'll set a date for your wedding. Unexpectedly, Richard Blake completely ignored Susan Blake's words, and instead brought up the matter of her marriage. In an instant, Susan Blake felt like she had fallen from the heavens to the earth, standing frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Deep down, she thought to herself, Will Father believe what I said? Leaving the main tent, Susan Blake appeared somewhat dazed. She truly couldn't understand her father's intentions. Here she was, racking her brain to frame Ethan Blake, yet her father suddenly mentioned her marriage, leaving her bewildered. As she walked, she accidentally bumped into someone. Looking up, she saw it was Jake Paul, who had come to find her. Annoyed, she snapped angrily, Are you blind while walking? Jake Paul immediately gave a wry smile. My lady, it was you who seemed lost in thought. How can you blame me? Humph. Susan Blake snorted coldly and muttered, It's all your fault for being useless, making me almost get caught by my father. Never mind. How are the preparations on your side? This time, we can't afford any mistakes. I've already talked to my father at length. Whether he believes me or not, as long as Ethan Blake dies, for the sake of the Duke's reputation, my father will have no choice but to believe. Rest assured, everything is set this time, Jake Paul replied with a cold smile. Ethan Blake, if the jade green tiger can't devour you, then the deadly poison of the cycle of souls order that I brought will surely take your life. Susan Blake and Jake Paul exchanged a knowing smile. From afar, they looked like a perfectly matched pair. Ethan Blake was only superficially injured by the claws of the jade green tiger, nothing serious. On the contrary, the medicinal power of the Genesis elixir was accidentally triggered during the fight with the jade green tiger, causing a surge in his bloodline, which resulted in his injury. Just as Henry Brooks had said, a few days of rest would suffice for recovery. Years ago, Charles Green had given him this elixir. However, due to its overwhelming potency, it left him in a prolonged coma. For reasons unknown, the medicinal power was suppressed in a certain part of his body and remained dormant thereafter. Now, with its accidental activation, Ethan Blake found himself unable to control it. Fortunately, Henry Brooks used the ethereal sky mirror to suppress the Genesis elixir's power once more. As a result, the residual energy was almost entirely absorbed by Ethan Blake, leaving no further danger. Lying on his back on the mat, Ethan Blake glanced at his body, wrapped in bandages, like a tightly packed dumpling, and couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. The royal physician brought by the Northern Guardian Duke initially recommended just minor bandaging. However, Sophia Blake felt that wasn't sufficient. After lunch, she personally came over to rebandage Ethan Blake, resulting in his current state. At this moment, she had just stepped out to prepare some food for him. Suddenly, the curtain of the tent was lifted, and someone entered, carrying a bowl of medicine. The strong scent of herbs wafted through the air. "Third Blake, why are you moving around so silently?" Ethan Blake, staring at the top of the tent, assumed it was Third Blake entering and casually asked, "Sir, Third Blake has gone hunting with the Duke. He instructed me to deliver your medicine." The newcomer replied in a deep voice. "Oh, just leave it there. I'll drink it later." Ethan Blake frowned, glancing at the unfamiliar face. The young man appeared to be around 18 or 19 years old, someone Ethan had never seen before in the Duke's residence. "Sir, the Duke specifically ordered me to ensure you drink the medicine before leaving," the young man respectfully said, holding the bowl of medicine out toward Ethan Blake. Ethan Blake let out a bitter laugh and remarked, "The Duke is truly considerate." With that, he reached out, took the bowl, and brought it to his lips. Chapter 33. The Message. Ethan Blake picked up the bowl of medicine. The strong herbal scent wafting into his nose made him frown slightly. He paused and asked, "What is your name?" Seemingly not expecting such a question, the person delivering the medicine appeared flustered but quickly regained composure and replied, "I am Darren Paul, sir." "Darren Paul? All the servants in the Northern Duke's residence bear the surname Blake. Why is your name Darren Paul?" Ethan Blake remarked as he placed the bowl of medicine on the small table beside the mat, turning to look at Darren Paul. Darren Paul's expression shifted slightly, and he took half a step back before responding. "I am new here, sir. The Duke has yet to grant me a name." "Oh." "Servants in the Duke's residence usually refer to themselves as the servant, yet you call yourself I? Tell me, who are you really?" Ethan Blake's demeanor suddenly turned sharp, his gaze piercing, as he stared directly at Darren Paul. "I truly am Darren Paul, sir. You are overthinking. You should drink the medicine." Darren Paul lowered his head, avoiding Ethan Blake's eyes, but his tone no longer held the respect it did earlier. Instead, it carried a hint of coldness. "You seem eager for me to drink this medicine. Could it be that there's something suspicious about it?" Ethan Blake said while silently gripping the dagger behind his back. Though seated on the mat, he was ready to strike at any moment. As he brought the bowl of medicine to his lips, a sudden sense of unease surged within him. That feeling of foreboding stemmed entirely from the unfamiliar servant, who called himself Darren Paul. That's why he put the bowl of medicine down, probing cautiously, thinking to himself that it was fortunate he was careful. If he had been careless and drank the bowl of medicine, he might have been poisoned and lost his life by now. A moment later, Darren Paul suddenly let out a sinister laugh, slowly raising his head, with a trace of contempt on his face as he said, "Not bad, you're very cautious. But today, you still won't escape death." As he finished speaking, he abruptly raised his hand, pressing it directly toward Ethan Blake's head. Instantly, an overwhelming pressure, suffocating like the collapse of the sky, surged forward. Though Darren Paul's movements were sluggish, they seemed to carry immense force. Ethan Blake's entire body froze, and though he tried to raise the short blade in his hand to counter, he found himself utterly unable to muster any strength. How bold! At that moment, the curtains of the large tent were pulled aside, and Sophia Blake, holding a long spear, shouted as she thrust it toward Darren Paul. "Humph! Courting death!" Darren Paul sneered, his hand that had been pressing toward Ethan Blake suddenly shifting to strike behind him. Thud! With a flicker of his palm, a fierce wave of energy mixed with dense black mist instantly enveloped Sophia Blake. "Your Highness!" At the same time, Ethan Blake leaped up from the banquet table, directly soaring over Darren Paul's head, diving into the black mist, and pulling Sophia Blake into his arms. His body rolled once on the ground before landing in a corner of the large tent. Looking at Sophia Blake in his embrace, her face was shrouded in a layer of black mist, her eyes tightly shut, seemingly unconscious. Ethan Blake himself felt a wave of dizziness, his body swaying unsteadily. Just as Ethan Blake jumped, 10 soldiers stationed outside the large tent rushed in one after another. Those entering first were inevitably engulfed by the black mist, crying out in alarm before collapsing to the ground. As the curtain of the large tent was lifted, a cold wind swept through, dispersing part of the black mist, making it thinner. Those who entered later were unharmed. Darren Paul, without even turning his head, kept his back to everyone and sneered. "Struck by my heavenly death-poisoned mist, you won't live past 7 days. I've done justice to the trust placed in me by others." As he finished speaking, everyone only saw a blur before their eyes, and Darren Paul vanished without a trace. "Heavenly death-poisoned mist? Cycle of Souls order?" Ethan Blake murmured, his body faltering as he collapsed. "Princess! Young master!" The soldiers who had not been affected by the poison mist immediately shouted in panic. Ignoring all hierarchy, they hurriedly carried Ethan Blake and Sophia Blake outside, transferring them to another large tent. Only 2 soldiers were left to guard the scene, awaiting the prince's return to make a decision. As for the soldiers who had rushed in first and inhaled the most poisoned mist, their entire bodies were enveloped in a layer of black mist that clung to them persistently. They were also carried away by their comrades, their fate uncertain. Ethan Blake felt as if the world was spinning, his body seemingly falling into an endless void, rising and sinking unpredictably, leaving him extremely uncomfortable. "The heavenly death-poisoned mist of the Cycle of Souls order is truly formidable. Ethan, receiving a drop of kindness from others, you must repay it with an entire stream. Speak. Where did you hide Charles Green's belongings? As long as I drink your blood and gain the medicinal power of the Genesis elixir, I can become an inner disciple." "Ah ha ha ha. Ethan Blake, Ethan Blake." Countless voices echoed around Ethan Blake's ears, sometimes distant, sometimes near, impossible to grasp. "Mother, am I about to die? I'm sorry, Mother. I can't fulfill your wish, can't make a name for myself. Forgive me. Mother." He felt as though he were a small boat adrift in a vast ocean, tossed about by towering waves, ready to be capsized and sink to the depths at any moment. A trace of despair rose in his heart. For an instant, it seemed as if he could see death. Suddenly, a warm and familiar current surged from somewhere deep within his body once again. This time, however, it was no longer as fierce as when he had battled the jade-green tiger. Instead, it became gentle, like a small stream flowing slowly through Ethan Blake's body. An indescribable sense of comfort instantly replaced the feeling of helplessness, as though he were basking in warm sunlight. At the same time, a voice echoed in Ethan Blake's mind. "Young one, I am truly sorry for involving you." "Ah, is it Taoist uncle?" Ethan Blake recognized the voice immediately, etching it deeply into his memory. He knew exactly who it was the moment he heard it. "Yes, it is I, Charles Green. Charles Green of Ethereal Hall. However, this is not truly me. This is a spell of mine, embedding a strand of my divine consciousness into your mind. Only when the time is right will this strand of consciousness awaken." "What is divine consciousness?" Ethan Blake asked, his heart filled with confusion. "You will naturally understand this in the future. Do not ask further, for my consciousness cannot last long. Listen to what I have to say." "All right." Ethan Blake nodded, his mind flashing back to that stormy snowy day in the small tavern, where a handsome and carefree Taoist had called him over to the fire to warm up. "You have consumed the Genesis elixir of my ethereal hall. Once the medicinal power is fully absorbed and paired with the cultivation method from the Codex of Might, you will easily establish a solid foundation for stepping onto the path of immortality. You must be wondering why I would do this. Because I need your help with something. I accidentally obtained a jade fragment that holds an earth-shattering secret. Whoever possesses it can rise to dominance on the path of immortality, becoming a ruler of their domain. If it falls into the hands of a sect, that sect could dominate the entire immortal realm. This jade fragment must never fall into the wrong hands. Otherwise, not only the immortal realm, but even the mortal world will face a great calamity. Thus, this jade fragment is of utmost importance. I can no longer return it to Ethereal Hall myself. Therefore, I use the divine elixir to transform your body, hoping you will spend a few years laying a solid foundation in cultivation. Then you may have the chance to meet Patriarch Li Qingxiu of Ethereal Hall and deliver the jade fragment to him. Patriarch Li Qingxiu is someone who has comprehended the grand path, free from desires and attachments. Only in his hands can the jade fragment bring no harm, dissolving this great catastrophe invisibly. That jade fragment, is it the very thing they were hunting you down for, forcing you to hand over? Ethan Blake thought to himself, then said, "But I don't have any jade fragment on me at all." "No, it's on your body. I've used a secret technique to seal it within you. Once you reach the complete spirit realm of the condensed pill stage, the seal will naturally dissolve, and you can retrieve it from your body." Condensed pill stage, complete spirit realm? How long will that take? Ethan Blake was stunned. He had some understanding of the condensed pill stage. Time? For cultivators, every time you ascend a realm, your lifespan multiplies. There's plenty of time. Charles Green's voice started to fade, becoming ethereal, as if it could vanish at any moment. "Taoist uncle, does that jade piece have a name?" Sensing the voice was about to disappear, Ethan Blake hurriedly asked. "This jade piece is called Tuet. You can call it Tuet Jade. Remember, before you meet the Patriarch, don't reveal this secret to anyone. Otherwise, everything will turn to dust." Charles Green's voice gradually faded away, as though it had never existed. Brother Ethan, wake up, wake up!" Just as Charles Green's voice vanished, another voice, filled with worry, rang in Ethan Blake's ears. He could tell it was the voice of the Blake brothers. "Ah!" Ethan Blake let out a groan, then forced his eyes open. He saw the 4 Blake brothers surrounding him, their faces full of concern. "You scared us to death. Thank goodness you woke up." Owen Blake exhaled deeply in relief upon seeing Ethan Blake regain consciousness.
Elder brother, where is Sophia? How is she doing?
Ethan Blake immediately thought of Sophia Blake. That dark aura, others might not recognize its danger, but he knew all too well how lethal it was. Even Charles Green, with his profound magical abilities, couldn't suppress the toxicity of the heavenly doom poison mist. At the mention of Sophia Blake, the four brothers' expressions instantly darkened. After a long pause, Connor Blake finally spoke.
Sophia's condition is extremely critical right now. Father has already sent a plea for help to Virtue Keep, but alas, I fear the time.
Connor Blake, usually rough and hearty, had reddened eyes when speaking of his younger sister.
I must see her.
Ethan Blake sprang to his feet, only to feel the world spin around him. Forcing himself to endure the dizziness, he attempted to leave the bed.
Brother Ethan, you just woke up. Don't move.
Owen Blake quickly intervened. Among the brothers, Owen Blake was the eldest. Though not physically strong, he was steady and mature. He understood that Ethan Blake's current weakened state made movement dangerous. If anything were to happen, they would have no way to explain it to their father. Ethan Blake waved his hand dismissively.
Elder brother, Sophia was poisoned by the heavenly doom mist while saving me. I must see her.
With that, he stubbornly stood up and headed out of the tent. The four brothers had no choice but to follow closely, supporting him on either side as they went. Chapter 34, Rejuvenation. A faint layer of black mist shrouded Sophia Blake's delicate face, giving her an ethereal and slightly eerie appearance. In another large tent, apart from the northern frontier king Richard Blake, his wife, the crown prince, and the princess were all present. Each person wore a worried expression, not daring to utter a word. Everyone knew that Sophia Blake, the youngest daughter of the northern frontier king, was cherished like a treasure in the palm of his hand. If anything untoward happened to her today, no one could withstand the wrath of the northern frontier king. An elderly royal physician, past his 60s, examined Princess Sophia's condition before shaking his head with a heavy sigh.
Your Grace, forgive this humble servant's incompetence. I cannot determine what poison the princess has been afflicted with. However, judging by her pulse, the toxin has already invaded her spleen and lungs. At most, in 7 days, it will reach her heart, rendering her condition incurable.
Richard Blake's face darkened as he nodded slowly, his voice slightly hoarse.
Deputy physician, thank you.
The deputy physician sighed again, his expression heavy with disappointment. He silently lamented that, despite being a renowned medical expert, he could not identify the poison affecting the princess. Doubts about his own skills began to creep into his mind. Richard Blake approached Sophia Blake, who lay motionless. Gazing at her youthful and tender face, a wave of sorrow surged through his heart. But as the northern frontier king, he could not act like ordinary parents, shedding tears to express his emotions. Instead, his rigid cheeks twitched slightly, burying his grief deep within.
We must uncover the one who assassinated Ethan Blake and poisoned Sophia for me.
Richard Blake's voice was not loud, but his fury roared like thunder in the sky, rolling in with overwhelming intensity. Everyone in the grand tent turned pale, exchanging glances to communicate silently, none daring to make a sound.
Your Highness, Ethan Storm requests an audience.
A voice suddenly interrupted from outside the tent.
Ethan is awake?
Richard Blake's eyes lit up, as though grasping a lifeline. His voice carried a hint of excitement.
Let him in.
The curtain was lifted, and Ethan Blake, supported by 4 of his brothers from the Blakes, entered. After paying his respects to Richard Blake, he approached Sophia Blake. Seeing her shrouded in black mist, he said,
Your Highness, the poison afflicting Sophia is the heavens' calamity smoke from the cycle of souls order.
What?
the heavens' calamity smoke from the cycle of souls order?
Richard Blake's expression immediately darkened, his voice rising a few notches.
Yes, the heavens' calamity smoke from the cycle of souls order. They were targeting me, but Sophia was injured in the process,
Ethan Blake said with guilt. At that moment, had Sophia Blake not shouted to stop Darren Paul's palm strike, he might have already lost his life. Richard Blake gritted his teeth as he uttered the words,
"Cycle of souls order,"
his gaze sweeping across the people in the royal residence until it paused briefly on Susan Blake. She flinched immediately, avoiding Richard Blake's piercing stare.
"Your Highness, please give this pill to the princess. It might suppress the effects of the heavens' calamity smoke and buy us some time,"
Ethan Blake said, producing a small, round bottle from within his robe and handing it to Richard Blake. This was the rejuvenation pill Ethan Blake had obtained from Granny Who at Storm Peak Ridge. After Snowy had used a portion, some remained. Richard Blake hesitated briefly before taking the bottle. Upon opening it, a fragrant medicinal aroma spread through the air. The deputy imperial physician, standing despondently nearby, suddenly stepped forward in front of Richard Blake. Fixing his gaze on the round vial in Richard's hand, he turned to Ethan Blake and asked,
"Young master, what kind of elixir is this?" "This is the rejuvenation pill. It's crafted from hundreds of rare medicinal herbs, refined using natural earth fire, and requires 49 days of tempering to produce just 21 pills."
Ethan Blake, who had spent over 3 months living in a secluded mountain cave, had acquired extensive knowledge about rare herbs. While he had not yet mastered the art of pill refinement himself, he had memorized many alchemical methods. He casually explained without much thought,
"This is the legendary
rejuvenation pill?"
The deputy imperial physician appeared entranced, staring blankly at the small vial. If not for the presence of the Northern Duke, he might have lunged forward to snatch it, turning it over in his hands in awe.
"Your Grace, the rejuvenation pill has potent medicinal properties. Let the princess take one first to observe its effects before proceeding further,"
Ethan Blake suggested. He was aware of the pill's remarkable ability to quickly dispel fatigue and heal wounds, but whether it could suppress the toxicity of the heavens' calamity poison remained uncertain. Thus, he dared not let Sophia Blake take more than one. Simultaneously, a plan formed silently in his mind. If the rejuvenation pill proved ineffective, his last resort would be to let Sophia Blake drink his own blood. After all, traces of the Genesis elixir's medicinal power still lingered in his bloodstream, and under the current circumstances, it might be able to suppress the heavens' calamity poison. Richard Blake nodded and tipped the vial, allowing a translucent rejuvenation pill to slide into his palm. He prepared to administer it to Sophia Blake himself. "Wait!" To everyone's surprise, Susan Blake suddenly called out loudly. She bit her lip, seemingly summoning all her courage, and stepped out from the crowd. Richard Blake halted his movements, his expression dark and unreadable. He spoke slowly.
"Susan, whatever it is, wait until Sophia has taken the medicine before speaking. Father, Ethan Blake's background is unclear. He has hidden in our estate for years with unknown motives. Now, his enemies have come for him, harming Sophia in the process. How can we recklessly allow her to consume his so-called elixir?"
Susan Blake glared at Ethan Blake, her eyes brimming with hatred.
"Susan, do not speak nonsense. His name is Ethan Storm, and he is the rightful heir of the Northern Duke,"
Richard Blake said, his brows furrowing as a cold glint flashed in his eyes. This time, not only did Susan Blake shudder, but even Ethan Blake was startled. The reason he harbored some apprehension toward Richard Blake was because, back then, when he mentioned Virtue Keep, a similar cold gleam flashed in Richard Blake's eyes. Today, he finally understood that the cold gleam was called killing intent.
"Father, he's an outsider. Why do you keep defending him like this?" If it weren't for him, how would Sophia have been poisoned? And the matter with my jade green tiger this morning, he caused that too. Are you just going to let him get away with it?
Susan Blake pressed on, her voice growing louder.
Humph. Susan, are you questioning your father's ability to judge people?
A trace of anger appeared on Richard Blake's face, and the cold light in his eyes deepened.
Your Grace, Susan is just speaking nonsense. Please don't be angry with her. She's your own daughter, after all.
At this moment, the graceful Duchess spoke up. Though now a middle-aged woman, she still exuded a captivating charm, and her words carried a subtle allure.
Humph. So young, yet already filled with ill intent. I'll deal with you later.
Richard Blake deeply favored this Duchess and, out of respect for her, decided to let it slide for now. He turned toward Sophia Blake and placed the revival pill into her mouth. The moment the revival pill touched saliva, it dissolved. As soon as it entered Princess Sophia's mouth, it transformed into a refreshing stream that flowed down her throat and into her stomach. In just a few breaths, the black aura on Sophia Blake's face began to dissipate. The revival pill truly lived up to its miraculous reputation. Ethan Blake also let out a quiet sigh of relief. He still remembered the day Charles Green suffered from a sudden poison attack. At that time, a certain pill from the ethereal hall was used to suppress the effects of the heaven-slaying poison mist. It seemed the revival pill had a similar remarkable effect. At the very least, this would buy some time for Sophia Blake. As long as the experts from Virtue Keep arrived, they would surely find a way to eradicate the poison. By now, the deputy imperial physician had regained his composure. Realizing his earlier loss of composure, his face flushed slightly with embarrassment.
Vice Imperial Physician, quickly check the princess's condition for me,
Richard Blake said, unable to contain his excitement upon seeing the effects of the rejuvenation pill. He immediately issued the order.
As you command.
The Vice Imperial Physician wiped the sweat from his forehead, secretly relieved that the Duke hadn't blamed him for his earlier panic. He quickly checked Sophia Blake's pulse and, after a long moment, praised.
The rejuvenation pill is truly miraculous. The poison has been suppressed, and for now, she should be fine.
Phew. Everyone in the tent let out a sigh of relief. As long as the poison was under control, they only needed to wait for Virtue Keep to send someone to fully detoxify Sophia Blake.
Among those present, only one person's face turned pale, Princess Susan. Earlier, in a moment of impulsiveness, she had sought to use this opportunity to implicate Ethan Blake,